The Dhoni Touch by Bharat Sundaresan. Introduction. वो देखो वहां धोनी, कुछ क्रिकेट में ध्यान नहीं है उसका, स्टाइलबाजी करता है बस. Look at Dhoni over there. He's not focused on cricket. He's a show pony, says a young man about Indian cricket's latest sensation. His companion pitches in. बाइक का शौकीन है, बाइक, गाड़ी, घड़ी, बस. He loves bikes. He's just about bikes, cars, watches. It's February 2005 and I am at one end of the long winding lobby at the Taj President, Vivanta now, in Mumbai, happily eavesdropping on these two cricketers talking about Mahendra Singh Dhoni to a bemused senior player. There in the city for the 2004-2005 edition of the Challenger Trophy, Dhoni, who made his international debut only 2 months earlier, is part of the India seniors team led by Saurav Ganguly. I'm there, waiting for a friend who's also a guest at the hotel. Meanwhile, at the other end of the lobby, Dhoni steps out of the lift and is immediately swarmed by a gaggle of reporters, many of whom I would go on to share a press box with. I was in college back then and had no ambitions of becoming a journalist. Decked casually in a t-shirt and shorts, Dhoni wades past them, his rust-colored mane resting on his shoulders. He doesn't say a word. Instead, he shakes his head twice before sauntering into the cafe for breakfast. Many of the reporters choose to leave, while some stick around the entrance of the cafe before they too are politely asked to leave by the hotel authorities. I stand there, amused by the melee. Little did I know then that in less than 5 years this joke would be on me too, and that I would end up spending hours in hotel lobbies and a lot of other places waiting for Dhoni and get nothing more than that impish smile from him for my efforts. The character assassination of Dhoni, by the way, isn't over though. The young men aren't done yet. और भैया बाल तो देखो, cricketer लगता भी है क्या? And brother, look at his hair. Does he even look like a cricketer? Says one. This last point resonates with me. There I stand, not too far from them, my hair nearly till my waist, and very used to these taunts about us, the follically blessed. There's something about long-haired guys that most Indians don't trust. Funny that, considering they have grown up listening to fables, mythological tales and religious texts where the protagonists all sport long manes and are extolled for their values. But when someone like me does it, it's considered too outre. And you end up hearing the same old cliches that Bob Seger sings about in Turn the Page. Is it woman? Is it man? I would have these Tamil mummies, aunts, walking up to my mother and consoling her. Despite the hair, Usha, your son is a good boy, they'd say. Their words would also be accompanied by looks of extreme concern. Hippie was a word that would be thrown around rather frivolously. It was as if they were all trying to say, "Baal to dekho, aapka beta lagta bhi hai kya? Look at his hair. Does he even look like your son?" My mother's reaction would generally range from surprise to bewilderment, and after a while she gave up trying to defend me. She would simply nod in agreement, but perhaps at some level she too bought into the theory that long hair on a man meant trouble. And it would have been understandable if it was one of those mummies writing off MS Dhoni's cricketing credentials at the Taj lobby based only on the length of his hair. But these were two contemporary cricketers, one of whom had already shared a dressing room with a young wicketkeeper batsman from Ranchi. Within a year anyway, Dhoni's hairstyle was the only thing India and Pakistan were both agreeing on. The mane was there to stay. Even dictator Pervez Musharraf agreed. He in fact ordered Dhoni to not even think about chopping his locks off. By then, Dhoni had also smashed 2 blitzkrieg centuries, including the highest one-day international ODI score by any wicketkeeper, established himself among the most destructive batsmen in world cricket, and was just a year away from taking over as India's T20 captain and winning the inaugural World T20, and chopping off his hair. It was not like Dhoni was a stranger to petty comments about his appearance. He had, in fact, heard worse. He was used to being typecast as an outcast from a young age. He was used to being an outsider. He was also more crucially used to being an outlier who proved people wrong at every step of his fascinating journey. The way he's managed to do it forms the focus of this book, as we try to break into Indian cricket's most popular enigma, who has remained a mystery wrapped in a $1 million bubble. This is not the story of where he's come from or where he's reached. It's about how he got there. It's not about how the Dhoni legend was born or how it was made, but about how his rational approach to life and cricket helped him scale dizzying heights. A man whose feet remained firmly on the ground despite the countless groundbreaking feats that made him the foremost sports star of his generation. In India, Sachin Tendulkar stands for perfection, the perfect 10, the man who could do no wrong, the man who was marked for greatness, prepared for greatness, and achieved greatness beyond anyone's imagination. He was a prodigy who grew up to be a prodigy. Dhoni wasn't any of that. Dhoni did the unexpected and continues to do so. He's the quintessential odd man out. He's as cut off from the system as you can be in the context of Indian cricket. He started his career playing for Bihar, a team that pretty much didn't exist on the Indian cricket map. Or it did just because it had to. However, in less than a decade, he ended up putting Ranchi, now in Jharkhand, on the world cricket map. There's a reason I have started off with his hair. The way he handled his hair over the years is in many ways the way he's dealt with his career, both on and off the field, with common sense, a lot of practical ingenuity, and some unmatched foresight. There's, of course, been a lot of serendipity that's helped him along the way, but you can't hold that against him. Dhoni held on to his long hair even after becoming an Indian cricketer. Perhaps that was because it fit perfectly within the youth icon image that he was targeting to project in terms of endorsements. And when he knew he'd gone past that budding superstar phase and become a full-fledged megastar after the World T20, he got rid of it. He embraced the power of social media before any of his peers or even those who came after him. Despite being a man whose life story remained close to the world, he was the first active cricketer to produce a movie about his life in which he revealed only as much as was required to make it a commercial hit. And a movie that required a lot of cajoling from his management team to get him to see. Dhoni is learned to have watched it eventually in 4 sittings. It was the hair that drew me to him in the first place, and not with any great fondness. In the early 90s, sporting a longish mane not only made you a social outcast, you also drew some unkind comparisons of the Bollywood kind. And considering Dhoni and I started growing our hair the same year, chances are he had to deal with the same. By the time my hair had reached neck length, I was Sanju Baba, the actor Sanjay Dutt. It only got worse from there. Tere Naam released in early 2003, and my hair, unfortunately, had the exact same length as Salman Khan's in the movie. The natural middle parting didn't help either. So, I would find myself serenaded with the song Tumse Milna, Baatein Karna, and have no option but to offer a wry smile in response. By 2004, the hair had moved on to that rock star, or let's say hippie phase. Then along came Dhoni. The first time I heard of him was when the rest of the world did, during his exploits on the India Air Tour to Nairobi in August 2004. It was a friend who alerted me. Dhoni's emergence also coincided with the heavy metal phase of my life, when I was surrounded by long-haired men. So it wasn't surprising that the first thing I heard about Dhoni was, "Uske baal dekhe? Have you seen his hair?" And yes, it was unique. I had never before seen a batsman with hair flowing down from the back of his helmet like Dhoni's was. Yes, Jason Gillespie sported a mullet, and even Kapil Dev had experimented with a ponytail in the twilight of his career. But never before had I seen someone with hair like mine. Even if it had the very earthy orange shade and looked intentionally straightened, donning a cricket helmet. It didn't even matter then that he was actually hitting the ball almost as hard as Adam Gilchrist. So the first thought in my mind was, oh no, now everyone will start calling me Dhoni. And I was so right about that. It was both obvious that Dhoni was a star in the making, not because I had any prophetic powers, but because it was just that obvious, and that I would soon go from being a Salman Khan wannabe to a Dhoni wannabe. A few years later, it would get worse when Ishant Sharma came onto the stage, but I'm not comfortable talking about that phase yet. Things did get better for both Dhoni and me as he became more successful. His hair had become the rage of the country, and there were many around India sporting the Dhoni hairdo, while mine had long overgrown that length. The more he succeeded, the more he swayed those around me towards believing that it wasn't so bad after all. For a man to let his hair down, quite literally, you could still be successful, very successful, and have more than 1 billion people rooting for you. Even those mummies' attitude started changing, and now at similar social gatherings where I was used to being frowned upon, I was often the cynosure. Apriye Dhoni mari inakane von polai. Your son looks just like Dhoni, they would say in Tamil, and my mother would end up beaming. However, I grew a fondness for Dhoni only after he decided to chop off the locks. It meant that I was no longer being convicted by every new person I met that my hairstyle was inspired by him. His reaction to the idea of this book and what it would be about was typical Dhoni. I had stopped him just before he entered the gladiator pit-like pathway towards the dressing room at the Maharashtra Cricket Association MCA Stadium and told him, "I'm writing a book on you, but it's not a biography since you've already released a movie about your life. It'll be my attempt at unraveling your enigma." The word enigma brought a smile on his face. He never quite committed to either giving me an interview or not giving one for this book. Unfortunately, an interview never happened, although once before an Indian Premier League training session, he did make a very startling revelation or declaration of Dhoni-esque proportions. "Kuch socha? Have you given it any thought?" I asked him. "19 ke baad, after the 19th, he replied. For the record, it was 14th April 2017. I thought, that's not bad. There are those who've waited for the proverbial eternity to get Dhoni to talk. I can't obviously be complaining about a 5-day wait. And without even trying to mask my delight, I ended up uttering, "Oh, that means only 5 days? That's great." Dhoni immediately spun around and, flashing that familiar smile again, said, 2019 ke baad, after 2019. At first, I felt a mixture of despair and anger at being snubbed like this. But in truth, he'd misunderstood my question. It was a period when everyone, probably even the selectors involved with Indian cricket, was either keen on knowing about or gunning for his retirement. And by the time I could clarify, Dhoni had sauntered off. This was the first of many attempts made during the IPL to get the definitive answer. From that point on, whenever the rising Pune supergiant RPS had a practice session at their home ground, I was there, stationed at that same spot where I'd informed him about the book. It was right below the dressing rooms and in the path which the players took to enter the ground. With Dhoni, you have to always pick the right time and the right place and not just hope to be there. Even those closest to him would agree. Dhoni would come and Dhoni would leave. He would stop, smile and exchange a few sweet nothings and then move on too swiftly for us to go beyond that. That was our IPL 10 routine. Then, during one of these meetings, he went after my hair. Tera baal to usse bhi lamba ho gaya. Your hair is longer than hers now, he said, pointing at a female standing not too far from me. I retorted, asking why he was after my name. He turned around and said, "Baal kaat lo yaar. Cut your hair, mate." Chapter 1. The Hair-Raising Tale of Mahi. अरे ये लड़की जैसा दिखने वाला, ढाबे में खाने वाला क्रिकेट क्या खेलेगा? How can this fellow, who looks like a girl and eats at a dhaba, play cricket? That's what the chief selector of the Mekong Metallurgical and Engineering Consultants Colony team had to say when he first encountered Dhoni and rejected him. The dhabe mein khane wala comment had to do with the fact that Dhoni's father was a pump operator at Mekong, which meant he was from the non-executive set. The boy's unconventional looks only made it worse. The D block that housed the Dhoni family was mainly made up of lower-grade employees, but the advantage was that the Mekong Stadium was across the road, and the only time the executive versus non-executive divide didn't exist was when Dhoni and his friends indulged in a game of football or cricket at the stadium. Incidentally, Dhoni's decision to grow his hair had nothing to do with fashion or changing his look. The story goes that Dhoni had never had a mundan, getting the head tonsured as a child, and when he finally did it in 2002, the hair started growing and looking good. He then decided to not cut it for a while and let it grow. अच्छा लग रहा है, रहने दो. Anyway, क्या फर्क पड़ता है? It's looking good, let it be. Anyway, what difference does it make? He would tell his friends. To compliment their Mahi, it's Mahi and not Mahi when you're in Ranchi. Or perhaps because they felt motivated, the rest of the Dhoni gang too began growing their hair, reveals Simant Lohani, better known as Chittu, his closest friend. However, one by one, they started falling prey to the scissor. The mirror wasn't being kind to them, Chittu insists. We all did it. Santosh Lal, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Gautam Da, and even I tried my hand at it, but only Mahi could pull it off. My face was too small. Not only was his hair looking great, it suited him superbly, says Chittu. It wasn't just his detractors in Mekong Colony who were bothered by Dhoni's growing mane. Even his school coach, Mahi's only coach, according to those in Ranchi, Keshav Banerjee, recalls being slightly worried about his favorite pupil. The longish hair, of course, came long after Dhoni had left school, and Banerjee would see him in the colony on his motorbike or walking to and back from practice. One day he couldn't help himself but let his former student know just what he thought of his hair. I asked him once about why he wasn't cutting it. He said, "Dekhte hain na kaisa lagega. Let's see how it looks." With that same smile, I said, "Acha nahi lagta. It's not looking good." I told him, "You are an adult now. I can't just order you to go cut it." He smiled again and said, "Baal hi hai, sir. Ek din ye style bhi change ho jayega." "It's only hair, sir. One day this style too will change," says Banerjee. Dhoni was right. The style did keep changing. It, in fact, went through a metamorphosis pretty much every other season. The mane was gone completely soon after Dhoni lifted the first of many titles as captain, the first ever World T20 crown in 2007. Then, of course, he went for the full Monty on the night India won the 50-over World Cup in April 2011. His once rustic, wannabe hep, mehndi-coloured long mane might have given way to a more sophisticated crop cut a dozen years later. But during those periods, he never failed to keep up with the times. An undercut spike one day, a quiff the next, not to forget the brash mohawk he sported during the 2013 IPL. And, amazingly, both his local barber in Ranchi and his stylist, Sapna Bhavnani, have seen their profiles get a boost thanks to their work with his hair. A year later, in 2008, I was a cricket journalist and covering an international match, an ODI between India and England at the Chinnaswamy Stadium in November, and about to come face to face with the man himself. It wasn't a meeting that I had thought about or longed for anxiously. To be honest, anxiously. It wasn't a meeting that I had thought about or longed for anxiously, to be honest. But as I waited for him to enter the press conference room at the Lalit Hotel on that rainy afternoon, I do remember thinking whether Dhoni would notice the hair. I wanted him to, anyway. I also wanted him to then think about how he'd given up on being one of us simply because he couldn't handle it. But nothing happened. My chance at this strange attempt at juvenile one-upmanship had come and gone. Actually, Dhoni notices everything. He never misses a beat or a note. Those who've known him from the early days in Ranchi swear by this Dhoni characteristic. He won't say much, but he observes everything. You hear every one of them say almost incessantly. It's something I had always noticed about him at press conferences, and it's a trait that is still there. Most cricketers have their own way of settling down before it starts, while the camera crew and reporters sort out their equipment. Dhoni's thing has always been to judiciously arrange all the phones and voice recorders together on the table in front of him so that they're all kind of bunched together. Even now, if he finds a phone or one with a distinct phone cover that he has probably not seen before, you'll see him pick it up and check it out. A few years ago, during a practice session on the eve of an ODI, Dhoni suddenly walked up from behind and said, "Bahut zyada badh gaye hain. It's become too long." That's when I realized that they don't exaggerate when they say Dhoni notices everything. He had noticed the hair, after all. I wouldn't say Dhoni and I are very close. The more tours I did, especially overseas, we did become familiar with each other, even if our conversations were mainly random chats on the sidelines of practice sessions. But this was the first time he'd ever remarked about my hair. However, from that point on, this was the first thing he would talk about every single time we crossed paths. And it was always he who brought it up. it was to become a little in-joke. Except that one time I asked him about how he'd mustered the courage to actually get rid of his long hair and never grow it to any significant length again almost a decade ago. We were in Harare for India's tour of Zimbabwe in 2016. It was a strange tour for Dhoni, where he was captaining a team mainly made up of fringe players, most of whom he'd never shared a dressing room with. He was stuck mostly within the confines of the hotel with this bunch of young guys he was just getting to know. It ended up being a great tour for him, even if he didn't score many runs. Dhoni ended up playing mentor and tutor to most of them on and off the field, and by the end of it, he was a refreshed man. It was like he had found a new purpose to continue doing what he was doing. In a career where he'd embraced enough gimmicks to put a World Wrestling Entertainment WWE wrestler to shame, he'd just found a new niche. Then he had a little piece of advice for me. तेरी बीवी क्या बोलती है? What does your wife say? He asked me. She doesn't mind it, I guess. She didn't ask me to cut it, even for our wedding, I replied. He then simply smiled at me and in that typical Dhoni fashion said, "So, do one thing. Cut it really short and go surprise her. She'll be happy," and walked away. Within just 6 months, he was coaxing me to give it a trim. Incidentally, his insistence on this started the day I told him about the book. I would like to believe it was just a coincidence. It was also the day he was about to meet the press in Pune after he'd announced his resignation as India's ODI and T20 captain. The warehouse-like press conference room next to the massive dog kennel at the MCA Stadium resembled a Mumbai local train with barely any standing space. I was near the entrance, right at the back. Dhoni arrived 5 minutes late. He was welcomed with that unmistakable wispy buzz that accompanies a poignant moment in time. And this was a massive moment. A man who had held what's considered the most nerve-wracking job in world cricket with not much more than some grace to show for it for nearly a decade, was now addressing the media as just another player. Like every one of my colleagues present, I too was revising the questions that I had in mind for the man. It was Dhoni, as usual, who broke the ice. He did so by targeting my hair again. पीछे से समझ नहीं आता कि तू है या कोई लड़की खड़ी है. From behind, I can't make out whether it's you or a girl, he said, resulting in giggles around us. Though slightly taken aback, I mumbled back something like, "Yaar, aap to ye mat bolo. You of all people shouldn't say that." But by then, he was almost at the business end of the room. Guess what? The first question was to Dhoni. Many people go to Tirupati to offer their hair to the Lord. Ever since you took up India's captaincy, you've offered your hair little by little to the country's cause. Will we get to see the hair back now that you are no longer captain? That was just Sunandan Lele being his jocose self. Dhoni made it clear that while he would stick to the team's needs as a batsman, the hair wasn't coming back ever. Little did I know that a throwaway comment on my hair would become his customized greeting. A week after the IPL of 2017, we were in England for the Champions Trophy. Nothing had changed in terms of our routine though. India began their campaign in Birmingham against Pakistan. And before I could even say hello as we crossed paths for the first time on English soil, Dhoni went, "Baal kaat lo yaar. Cut your hair, mate." It was the same at the Oval a few days later as India went back to London for their remaining league matches. He would see me, smile as he got closer, and then the same line again. Soon, some of my fellow journalists caught on to it and would preempt his greeting with their own versions of Bal Kaat Lo Yaar when they saw Dhoni approaching. At times, I would get a word or two in about how there were other things like the book we could talk about, but he always ended up with the final word. Soon, the Champions Trophy was over, with India losing that famous final at the Oval to Pakistan. Our hair saga was to continue for a few weeks more, that too with new characters joining the cast. Dhoni and India left for the Caribbean following the Champions Trophy for a 3-island tour which involved 5 ODIs and a solitary T20. So did I. And Dhoni's fixation with getting my hair cut continued. With fewer reporters, the density of media presence had gone from, say, that of Mumbai's western suburbs to the Western Australian outback. Dhoni and I did get slightly more time for our sweet nothings. And somehow, almost every conversation started with Bal Kaat Lo Yaar. Dhoni was one of the few cricketers who had his family in tow for the tour. Soon enough, even his wife and daughter joined the anti-hair campaign. 2-year-old Ziva was first on the job. The Indian team was staying in Antigua at the very posh Sugar Ridge Resort, which has steps leading to the cottages located on a rather steep hill. With the stadium a good 40-minute ride away on Antigua's narrow and unkempt roads, the team management decided to hold the daily press conferences at the hotel itself. I was staying by myself in a desolate part of the island in the north and would generally stay back at Sugar Ridge to finish my daily work. There, I would end up witnessing the Indian players, the starry ones included, indulging in rather mundane activities. It ranged from Captain Virat Kohli carrying a heavy load of water bottles up to his cottage located on the highest point of the resort, to Dhoni ferrying food for his wife and daughter. The latter would walk down with a few empty plastic boxes to the team room, a dining place right outside the lobby, and then appearing a few minutes later with them filled with food. बीवी और बच्चे की सेवा चालू है. I continue to serve my wife and kid, he said, intuitively anticipating my question. The next time I was there, Dhoni was on babysitting duty and was busy being a doting father to Ziva. And as he carried her back up to their room, Dhoni spotted me. But rather than go for his catchphrase himself, he tried to make Ziva do it. Tell him, Bal kaat lo. Ask him to cut his hair, he said. Fortunately for me, Ziva either didn't care or perhaps didn't agree with her dad. Sakshi, though, was totally on her husband's side. A few minutes after Dhoni and Ziva had left, she walked into the lobby and was soon asking the media manager, Gaurav Saxena, about the boys. When Gaurav told her that they were fine and Mahi had given me the usual grief, she carefully scanned my hair and then almost immediately said, "Hi yaar, I think I want to cut your hair myself." "Why is your entire family after my hair? Leave me alone," I quipped, to which she said, "Let's fix a date. We'll do it in Jamaica. I'll even get Mahi on the job. It'll be great fun." "Yeah, at my expense," I said. There was a slightly awkward encounter the day after Dhoni had been criticized heavily by everyone, including me, following his bizarrely stodgy 58 off 108 balls with just a single boundary. It was a match where India had fallen 11 runs short of chasing the meagre total of 190 set by a second-string West Indies outfit. Dhoni was undone by a maverick seamer, Kesrick Williams, playing only his second ODI, and the sword over his head had only gotten sharper. By the time I reached the airport the next morning en route to Jamaica for the final leg of the tour, the Indian team was already making its way in. Desperate to get to the check-in counter before them to avoid the obvious delay, I was rushing through, only to be stopped in my tracks. There stood Mrs. Dhoni, holding the pram and flashing an ominous smile, while her husband was brandishing an imaginary scissor in my direction. It was also another example of what everyone around Dhoni considers to be his greatest attribute, of being able to live in the moment. It's rare for any sportsperson to look so relaxed and at peace with the world and himself at a time when the axe seems so perilously close to his neck. But that's Dhoni for you. The gesturing and the taunting continued through the week in Kingston from all members of the Dhoni family, but somehow they couldn't get to me. As the tour came to an end, I had my final encounter with Dhoni. It, of course, began with the customary Bal Kaat Lo Yaar jibe before I inquired about whether he would be travelling to the USA, which he had done post previous tours to the Caribbean. When asked why he's been so hell-bent on the haircut, he put it down as a matter of practical advice. The way he put it across was very akin to what we hear from him often over the stump camera. I suddenly felt like I was a spinner at the top of my mark, with Dhoni shouting out some prudent order from behind the stumps. Don't need to cut it fully. Layering kara le. Same length, less weight. Chapter 2. The Mekong Boy. पागल खाने के लिए माना जाता था सर रांची। कहां एक मेकॉन कॉलोनी के लड़के ने हम सबको आसमान तक पहुंचा दिया। Ranchi was known mainly for an institution for the mentally ill, and from nowhere a boy from the Mekong colony has taken us to the skies. You don't have to look or listen too hard to realize that Chittu Simant Lohani is besotted with his mahi. Chittu is Dhoni's oldest friend. They met at the Dayanand Anglo-Vedic Jawahar Vidya Mandir school while still in junior school. Chittu isn't exaggerating or indulging in loose-tongued hyperbole when he talks about his schoolmate putting Ranchi on the map. It's a fact. Many have likened what Dhoni has done for his hometown to what Sir Don Bradman did for his hometown, Bowral. But Ranchi is not a sleepy, nondescript town to the southwest of Sydney. It's, if anything, steeped in Indian history. Once ruled by the Mauryan Empire, the people of Ranchi were used to fighting off insurgents, and often with success. They had thwarted the Mughals on one occasion and even gained independence before being recaptured. After the British took over, Ranchi became one of the epicenters of the uprising against colonial rule towards the end of the 19th century and was one of the strongholds of the revolutionaries throughout the freedom struggle till 1947. During this time, the district witnessed a number of revolutionary campaigns and anti-British crusades led by Ganesh Chandra Ghosh, the Chittagong-based freedom fighter who started his own revolutionary party. It was in Ranchi that Mahatma Gandhi met the then Lieutenant Governor of Bihar and Orissa in 1917 regarding the Champaran issue, which led to the first ever satyagraha of any kind in the country. The city kind of slipped off the national radar in independent India despite being home to ample natural and mineral resources. In the 1990s and well into the millennium, the region became known for producing a high number of civil service officers and for having a high literacy rate. But then, it also had to grapple with innumerable power cuts, where families found it prudent to finish cooking their dinner before the sun set. But it was Dhoni who firmly put Ranchi on the map again. There is an article online titled "What Made Ranchi Famous Before Dhoni Came Along" by wicketkeeper. It deals with some of Ranchi's other claims to fame, mostly of yore, including Birsa Munda. Born on 15th November 1875, he was a tribal leader and one of the youngest freedom fighters of that era, whose activism against missionaries and the British left a major impact on India's freedom struggle. The fact that he died when only 25 in a Ranchi jail puts things in further perspective. He was later honoured with the title of Birsa Bhagwan. The Ranchi airport is named after Munda, who had even started his own religion. It is said that he did things his own way, often to the bemusement of those around him, much like the man who challenged him to the title of Ranchi's most famous son a century later. Dhoni has himself spoken about the anonymity that his city was engulfed in for years, even as recently as his early days in international cricket. He mentioned this when the JSCA Stadium was inaugurated in 2013. It's anybody's guess whether Ranchi could even have dreamt of having its own state-of-the-art ground, which would become a regular centre for cricket at the highest level, if not for Dhoni. When I started my international career, people during the overseas tours used to ask me where I came from. I would first say India, then Jharkhand, and then Ranchi. The next question invariably was, "Where is Ranchi?" I had to explain in different ways by saying, "It's near Calcutta, near Jamshedpur, from where Tata originated. It's India's richest state in terms of minerals. Now the city has its own cricket identity. I can proudly say I'm from Ranchi because of this international stadium." The Times of India quoted Dhoni as saying, "Nobody knows Dhoni better than Chittu." This is coming from the man himself. After having waited for him enough times at the MCA Stadium, I had eventually given up the ghost and resigned to my fate. Then, one day, I thought it better to ask Dhoni himself about how he would have gone about the task of discovering the real Mahi. Following a dramatic pause, he said, "एक ही आदमी है, चिट्टू, लेकिन वो तुझे मिलेगा नहीं. There's only one man for the job, Chittu, but he won't meet you," and then walked away, mouthing something about finding Chittu namumkin, impossible. A couple of days later, I got a call from an unknown number, and the man on the other side introduced himself as Chittu. He said I should come over to Ranchi the very next day. Taken aback, I only got my head around the identity of the caller once I heard the words, "Mahi ne kaha hai ki aap aoge." Mahi had said that you would come. Flight tickets were booked on the fly, and though I couldn't make it as swiftly as Chittu wanted me to, I was in Ranchi the day after. It would be unfair to say that the Dhoni-Ranchi relationship is one-sided. A lot of why and how Dhoni is the way he is can be traced back to where he comes from. Like with most people, our groundwork takes you sky high is the sign that welcomes you into Ranchi. They couldn't have picked a more apt slogan for the city or its beloved son. It explains both what the city represents and the meteoric rise of Dhoni. There's an understated yet ambitious air to the city. It remains largely middle class, but the real estate is booming with state-of-the-art residential complexes mushrooming on all sides. But still, the market area, or main road as it's more eloquently referred to there, carries a rather bourgeois feel to it. Though not aggressively advertised, there is enough tourism potential there. It's called the City of Waterfalls to attract visitors in search of the real India experience. It is a city, Locals believe that is urbanizing at a rapid pace. Ranchi is a highly cosmopolitan agglomeration teeming with the educated classes from across the country who came in search of better opportunities post-independence and migrators from its hinterlands who came in search of jobs, especially after it became the capital of Jharkhand in 2000. It has transformed over the years from being a forest inhabited by tribes to being the administrative headquarters for the British and then to an industrial town with major companies like Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, BHEL, Mecon, Steel Authority of India Limited, SAIL, etc. located there. A considerable change in land use has occurred during the last 4 decades. Ranchi has been handpicked to become one of the 100 smart cities by the government's Smart City India mission. This is information I get from a friend who has called Ranchi home for most parts of her life and is extremely touchy about all things Ranchi. Chittu has already booked a room for me, or informed the hotel staff before I land, and it's a 4-minute car ride from the airport. Hotel Green Acres, like every other place in Ranchi, has its own Mahi memory, and I'm told about it as I check in. He used to often come here to our rooftop restaurant with his friends early on. At times, he would even be kind enough to pose for pictures with the staff. Obviously, he doesn't get time to do that very often these days, the receptionist tells me. The Green Acres' big attraction, apart from its well-kept rooms, is the food, the South Indian food in particular. The hotel itself represents the changing face of Ranchi. It now boasts of its own gourmet patisserie, aptly named Sugar High, which is run by the owner's daughter. There's a Mahi connection here too, of course. Chandrakant Raipat, the owner, went to school with the man himself. His daughter, Vandita Raipat, who finished her studies in Bangalore and worked briefly in Mumbai before shifting back to her roots to start Sugar High, has her own Dhoni story. It's about the time when she and her friends were cycling around Mecon colony and blocked his car, refusing to budge until he came out and gave them autographs. He did eventually step out. He was smiling and gladly posed for pictures with us, she says. She doesn't sound a tad embarrassed about it. It's Mahi after all. The people of Ranchi have a legitimate claim on him. In less than an hour after I check in, Chittu is on his way to meet me. His first look at me is rather incredulous. I expected someone much older to be writing a book on Mahi, he tells me. I could see he was also expecting someone a lot more conventional looking. Chittu is diminutive, stout, and wears thick glasses. The first thought in my head was how perfectly the casting director for Dhoni, The Untold Story, nailed the Chittu character. The first thing he does is pull out his phone and insist that I see the McDowell's Soda No. 1 Yari Hai ad that Dhoni had shot with Chittu and Chotu Bhaiya, Paramjeet Singh, who was a former clubmate of Dhoni and got him his first sponsor before he became the elder brother of Mahi's inner circle. It's a tastefully shot video that manages to indulge in nostalgia without seeming corny at any point. It used to be on TV till a couple of years ago, and the full version is up on YouTube. The camaraderie and intimacy between the three friends is evident in every scene, whether it is Dhoni making fun of Chittu's chai or getting the better of him in an impromptu game of cricket. Dhoni's mega stardom isn't compromised, as his friends use a selfie with him as a bait to get a discount from the caterer. Overall, it achieves its purpose perfectly, to depict that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The script Chittu reveals, was written by Dhoni himself. The final scene is a touching exchange between the two schoolmates as Chittu speaks wistfully about the good old days and the fun they used to have, to which Dhoni, showing some rare emotion, puts his arms around the two and says, "Kuch nahi badla yaar. Nothing has changed, mate." There's also a scene where Dhoni picks on Chittu's slightly generous midriff. "See how he doesn't let go of that one opportunity he has to make fun of me and my weight. He didn't tell me about it before the shooting began," he says with a smile and emotion in his voice. As I look up, I also find a glint of a tear or two welling up behind the spectacles. I assume Chittu gets emotional every time he sees the ad. Being very close to a big-time celebrity in India leaves you in a dangerous state of suspended disbelief. It's a weird drug that few can handle, mainly because you can never be in control of its effects. There are the highs, of course, of getting to rub shoulders with and enjoying a personal relationship with someone who a billion others would give anything to catch a glimpse of. It's also an addictive high, but one you are totally dependent on your celebrity friend for providing. You are only important till he or she is, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's also always the overriding fear that the friendship itself could get eclipsed at any point. Chittu, to his credit, acknowledges the fickleness and responsibilities of being a celebrity confidant. He's tried to keep his personal life divorced from the Dhoni phenomenon that unwittingly engulfs most other facets and faculties of his life. Our chats are repeatedly interrupted by calls from Sakshi, who is seeking Chittu's expert opinion on some home matter. The Dhonis are in the process of shifting to their new house in Harmu when I'm in Ranchi, and it's the best friend who is the decision maker when the man is not around. Wherever he goes, he's known as Chittu Bhai, Mahi ka dost. He loses his cool briefly when the security guard at the JSCA stadium asks him to move his car from the VIP parking spot, but he doesn't have to throw any names around. The ground in charge is fortunately at hand, and he steps in to explain that the guard is a new appointee and therefore not aware of Chittu's identity. But Chittu doesn't impose his celebrity influence over anyone. "Rehne dijiye, naya hoga. Let it be. He must be new." He then pats the guard on the back. We don't hang around the hotel for too long. Chittu can't afford to. He's a busy man when in Ranchi. Mekong Colony will be our first stop, he tells me as we get into his car. It's a Santro. And before I ask, he tells, Mahi gave this to me a few years ago. Before this, he had given me a Scorpio, the most expensive car I've ever owned. He also had bought me my first bike, he adds. That's why Mahi is special and greater than all other famous cricketers in the world. He doesn't believe in leaving anyone behind. He might have become the biggest celebrity in the country right now. But वो इस चीज में मानता है कि सबको साथ लेके आगे चलना है. But he believes in taking everybody forward. It's true at many levels, I realize. Though Dhoni has been associated with Riti Sports for years now, he also lets Chittu and a former Jharkhand teammate, Mihir Divakar, handle his other newer clients. And it doesn't take me too long to realize what Dhoni had meant when he talked about his friend's elusiveness. One of the first things Chittu tells me is that he doesn't do interviews. He keeps a lower profile than even Dhoni in Ranchi. His phone is forever buzzing, but he answers only those numbers that he can recognize. He keeps two phones. One is a private number that only a few, I'm in the illustrious list now, have access to. He tells me how privileged I am, not once but on quite a few occasions. Then a quick reminder, I'm meeting you only because Mahi asked me to, or I just don't talk to anyone. Mekong Colony. Dhoni didn't just put Ranchi on the map, he also put Mekong Colony on the silver screen and on every television set across the country. We enter the colony gate with Chittu throwing a customary nod to the security guard. This is after Chittu has shown me Sanjay tea stall, located a few meters from the colony gate, which is where the Mahi army would convene on a daily basis once the cricket was over. It has now become one of the many selfie points in Doranda when tourists come here on an MS Dhoni tour. It's a modest shop that sells your usual fare of samosas and other basic savories, along with those customary jeera biscuits that are so characteristic of these shops. The Mekong residential complex in Ranchi, some 5.2 kilometers from the airport in the busy suburb of Doranda, is over 60 years old now and, according to Chittu, hasn't changed much since the time his family moved here. It's a gated community with its evident class hierarchy like most government-owned colonies around the country. The size, wear and tear, and overall aesthetics of the many residences give away the financial status of their respective residents. Chittu takes me on a guided tour of the colony, beginning from the places the two childhood friends used to hang out. Finally, he parks outside the Mekong Stadium. It's around 6 p.m. and the guard has locked the gate. Chittu flexes his influence and the guard obliges. As we walk in, Chittu takes a whiff of the summer air and smiles. Perhaps it's his way of saying nothing's changed at all. He immediately starts pointing out the various Mahi landmarks. Mahi's family used to stay somewhere in M Block before, and then they moved into N Block overlooking the stadium. That was his building, and 2 blocks behind it was mine, says Chittu, pointing to his right. He then points straight ahead, beyond the boundary wall at the far end at a clutch of dull-coloured buildings, amidst which the one in white stands out even from a distance. That was our school. So we were very lucky that we hardly had to walk 5 minutes to get there. Behind the school was where Mahi's dad's office used to be. To the left is the pump room where his father would often come to do his work while we would be playing. Duty yahan tha, ghar wahan aur school wahan piche. His workplace was there, the house there, and the school behind. It's at this DAV school that Chittu met Mahi while they were still tots. They were polar opposites, but hit it off immediately. He was a unique kid. Ekdam shant, always quiet. I never saw him do kid stuff, playing pranks, or being cranky, or throwing tantrums. ऐसा नहीं कि एकदम झटपट कुछ कर रहा है. He never did anything out of the blue. No badmashi, mischief either. He was in his own world mostly, almost too sorted to be a child, says Chittu, adding that even at that young age, what was apparent about Dhoni was a keen sense of knowing what to do, when to do it, and giving it all his focus and energy. Very dedicated to his work, if he decided that he had to do something, wo karna hi hai, he would definitely do it. He wouldn't study through the year. He would study while the monsoons were on and we couldn't play out much. He wouldn't revise much even when it was exam time. I never saw him mugging up like we used to. It is a first-class brain. Mahi's dad used to come up with this popular dialogue during exam time. Whoever has studied all year long doesn't need to study at the last minute. And whoever hasn't studied all year, usko bhi last minute studies की जरूरत नहीं है. he too doesn't have to study at the last minute. Wise advice indeed, something you can almost imagine Dhoni using with his bowlers. Think S. Srisanth often during his captaincy. The upbringing in both households had a mixture of freedom and discipline. Mahi and Chittu had a curfew to contend with and be back home by 6:30 p.m. regardless of whether they were done playing or not. The adults worked really hard to keep the household going, and they expected the kids to do their bit in terms of cultivating self-discipline when it came to school matters. After playtime, come back home, wash up, and then sit down to study. Everything was fixed for us. Get up early, go to school, play, and then study. That's why you'll never see Mahi ever being late to any place. That discipline is so deeply ingrained in him, says Chittu. Chittu claims to be hot-headed and someone who even now doesn't think twice before getting into a scuffle. I was the ultimate badmash, very short-tempered and would keep getting into fights. Even now, when Mahi sees me getting angry with someone, he'll mockingly warn that guy, saying, "Acha hai, he's running short of enemies at the moment." Despite hanging out with such a cool guy, I have never been able to change that side of me. He rues. Dhoni's innate steadfastness would be raised to new levels when it came to sport, says Chittu. It didn't matter what sport he was involved in. It would reveal a new side to Dhoni, one where he would allow himself to show emotion and, at times, even lose his cool. Chittu recalls being Mahi's doubles partner in badminton and the responsibility that came with the role. You had to play seriously. That was the only time I would see him get angry. If even for a single point he felt or got the feeling that I wasn't being as serious as he was, all hell would break loose. खेलना है तो seriously खेलो, नहीं तो चले जाओ. If you want to play, play seriously. Otherwise, go away. That was the first warning. The next time he would just shout, भाग जाओ यहाँ से, तुम में seriousness नहीं है. Get lost from here. You are not serious. Chittu says that the single-mindedness which Dhoni brought to the task at hand in childhood is evident even today when his friend is busy on the iPad playing one of his beloved shooting games or football. He's fully into it with 100% concentration. But he's still listening to everyone. And if anyone thinks, even for a second, that he's fully fixated on the game and isn't paying attention to what they've said, then they will be in for a shock. He says with that same awe with which he describes most of Mahi's characteristics. The Mekong Stadium is where Mahi and Chittu spend their evenings playing football and, on the odd occasion, some cricket. This was also the only Ranji Trophy venue in Ranchi before the Dhoni phenomenon occurred. And even though cricket was an afterthought most of the time back then, the future India captain would not miss a single ball of the action whenever Bihar was playing a match at the Mekong Stadium. Sitting on the terrace of N171, his first residence there, the two boys would soak in the Ranji action all day long. It is an envious position to be in, having a first-class ground across the road from you, especially in India. The boy literally grew up with high-level cricket at his doorstep. For most cricketers who make it to the top, especially from the hinterland, the first-class match they witness is often the maiden one they get to play in. As Chittu recalls, Dhoni was never a mute spectator. The stump microphone has over the years revealed that he just can't stop talking when a match is on. Even back then, he was constantly formulating theories and passing judgments on those playing. Bihar used to have a fast bowler called DJ Singh, and Mahi was always amazed at how quick he bowled. He would keep talking about his pace. Honestly, I wasn't someone who loved discussing cricket for too long, but Mahi would keep at it. It's funny that these days he bashes up bowlers who are much, much quicker than that fellow he used to rave about, says Chittu with a smile. Amazingly, it was right here at the Mekong Stadium that Dhoni made his first-class debut when he was 18. He played against Assam and scored an unbeaten 68. When you think of it, it must have been akin to playing your first big-ticket match at the same building compound or gully you learned to play the sport in. In early 2015, while the World Cup was on down under, it was announced that the Mekong Stadium would be renamed the Mekong MSD Stadium in a year's time. But here I am in May 2017 and it still reads Mekong Stadium in bold blue letters. It lacks the MSD touch, quite literally. When asked about it, Chittu just shakes his head, his brows furrowing, but for once he holds back. It's at this precise moment that Umakant Jena, Jenada to the locals, joins us. Umakant Jena, now well into his 60s, has been the curator at Mekong Stadium for nearly 2 decades and was one of the early witnesses to the rise of Dhoni. He's heavily tanned and carries all the signs of long hours spent under the unforgiving Ranchi sun. And he, like Chittu, is displeased, almost anguished, at the fact that the man who brought Mekong and Ranchi such glory does not have his name up there yet. Despite all that he's done for the city, the locality, and the country, they're yet to give him any recognition. It's been over a year since they publicly announced the renaming of the stadium. But you see, nothing has happened yet, says Jenada before recounting his own version of the snub Dhoni received from the elitist Mekong team selectors, one that they've never gotten over, even if the man himself has moved on. तभी भी नहीं समझे और अभी भी नहीं समझ रहे कि माही है क्या? Even in those days, they, the powers that be at Mekong, did not understand what Mahi was, and even now they don't. The veteran curator puts things in perspective. By now, Chintu has silenced at least half a dozen phone calls, and when his phone rings yet another time, he turns around and points at one corner of the stadium to the left of the pavilion, and once again simply shakes his head. This time, though, he manages a few words. They had promised to turn one section of the Mekong ground into a Mahi museum. You have no idea how excited he was, says Chittu, his finger still pointing towards what looks like a mix of rubble and debris. He had even kept his stuff ready to give away, but they never came for it. Chittu grits his teeth like there's an invective on its way, but nothing. He goes back to shaking his head, now more vigorously than before. The repeated rebuffs that those close to him lament about have hardly deterred Dhoni from showing up at his literal home ground. He still shows up here whenever he's in town and indulges in some nostalgia, something that he enjoys doing, says Chittu, which, in its own way, is surprising for someone who's celebrated for living in the moment. Jenada, now smiling, is quick to talk about the last time Dhoni came to the Mekong Stadium. It was when he was visiting a friend in the colony and heard that there was a junior soccer tournament underway at the venue. Unannounced, he just landed up at the stadium and rather than sit in the office room, plonked himself in the one concrete stand that provides a rather nice viewing experience of the action at the Mekong Stadium. What followed was an inevitable melee. Like it happens in India so often, thousands appeared literally out of nowhere and the stadium turned into an uncontrollable cauldron. The game, which had continued for a few minutes post Dhoni's arrival, had to be halted as security guards were called in to clear the crowd. Dhoni had no way out, and there were even suggestions made that he jump down from the stands into the parking area, a good 12 feet drop, and make a quick getaway. Sanity prevailed though, and Janada insists that Dhoni stayed back and watched the match till it was over, and even gave away a few prizes before leaving in one piece. Janada too has his own recollections of Mahi before he became MSD. He and Dhoni's father, Pan Singh, who moved to Ranchi from his village of Almora in Uttarakhand back in 1964, would play cards together on Sundays and public holidays. Janada now stays in the same quarters that Chittu and his mother used to back in the day. He remembers how Pan Singh was never too appreciative of his son's passion for sports, well documented now in the movie. But while he tried to stay clear of his son's sporting exploits within the colony, Janada would catch Pan Singh slyly watching Mahi in action through the grooves on the stadium's boundary wall facing their residence. Though his office was behind the school, he would often go to the pump room for some routine work. On his way back, he would quietly go to that corner and watch Mahi bat, and even smile once in a while if he saw his son hit a boundary. He thought nobody knew, but we have known each other for 30 years, and I can pick him out from afar. I never bothered him though. I didn't want to ruin his special moment, says Janada. But Pan Singh, says the curator, didn't appreciate his son compromising on his studies. He disliked Dhoni accepting the never-ending invites to play in tennis ball cricket tournaments. He would get angry, scold him, and come and complain to me. Our card games would be interspersed with his rants about how his, Dhoni's friends, keep coming and taking him away to play in those canvas ball tournaments, as he would call them. That tournament there, this tournament here, the boy shouldn't lose focus on his studies, Janada, he would tell me. Janada would generally just put an arm around the concerned father and tell him that his son was already creating a buzz with his batting feats and that he was made for bigger things. That mahal, atmosphere, started with just the kids he used to play with. Nobody expected him to go too far, but soon the whole colony was talking about it, his cricketing feats. Before you knew it, everyone wanted a piece of Mahi, and everyone wanted to be part of what they assumed, and correctly so, would be a journey to superstardom, but still not quite like this. The boy would simply not leave the ground, and if it was raining heavily, he would be the first one out with his football, he says. Even though this is peak summer, the light fades fast in the east of India. Chittu wants us to get going so that we can take a few pictures of the colony before it's too late. As he's about to leave, Janada taps him on the shoulder and whispers something into his ear. It's something to do with him not receiving payment for a job he'd done at another ground. Chittu pacifies the old man and tells him that it'll be done. It's a role that Chittu ends up playing wherever he goes, that of the proxy agent, caretaker, and problem solver for pretty much everyone close to Dhoni, and he does it well. We are now right outside N171, where Dhoni grew up. There are a few kids playing cricket in the gully parallel to the building. Chittu politely asks them to continue with the game as it would enhance my photograph of the place. Understandably, the batsman, who'd till then been trying to pierce the tiny gap between the two fielders on the offside, now wants to only attempt the helicopter shot. He has, of course, been informed about the purpose of my visit, and the boy knows exactly whose former house he's batting next to. "Some trivia for you," says Chittu, pointing at the building. "You know, he used to stay on the first floor, but when they were shooting for the movie, they couldn't get a good shot of that house from here. So we convinced the residents on the second floor above what was Mahi's home to allow us a few days to shoot at their house. Chittu should know. He was the unofficial consultant for the movie and spent hours and days with the script writers and director, taking them around the many points of interest in Ranchi, including the Mekong colony. N171 was a two-room house with one wall covered with Sachin Tendulkar posters, thanks to the young boy who grew up dreaming of one day playing cricket for his country. This love and immense respect for Tendulkar never faded away even after Dhoni took over as Indian captain and technically had his idol play under him. On the field, Dhoni was always the captain. Tendulkar might suggest a bowling change to him, asking him to bring on a spinner, but Mahi would tell him politely that it wasn't a great idea and would stick to his plan of keeping the fast bowler going. He always remained the general, but if Mahi ever saw Sachin walking towards him in a hotel lobby, he would always instinctively give way. That was out of genuine respect, and he never ever was faking it, says one close confidant of Dhoni. And how can we forget the mobile guard of honor that Dhoni instigated at the Wankhede Stadium in November 2013 on Tendulkar's final moments as an international cricketer? There's a fascinating episode narrated to me by someone quite close to both, wherein Sakshi wanted Tendulkar's autograph before his final test in Mumbai. And despite being captain, Dhoni kept dilly-dallying, but Sakshi had had enough. It was the night before the match, Tendulkar's 200th and final test against the West Indies at the Wankhede, and the Dhonis ended up outside Sachin's room after much deliberation, with Dhoni insisting it wasn't a great idea to disturb him. He waited for a couple of minutes before knocking, and once Sachin opened the door and asked them to come in, Dhoni is believed to have rather sheepishly said, "Sorry, Sachin, she wants your autograph on this shirt. Aap jaldi de do. You please give it to us quickly and we'll be off." Despite Tendulkar's insistence that the two should come in, Dhoni had his way and Sakshi the autograph. The Dhoni family moved out of N171 in 2005, the year he scored those two breathtaking ODI centuries, including the highest score for a wicketkeeper in 50-over cricket, 183 not out against Sri Lanka at Jaipur, and into a bigger house within the colony. It was an individual house with a garden at the back, and this is our last stop as the light has all but faded. Meanwhile, Chittu has already set up my next meeting. It's with Keshav Lal Banerjee, the man who turned Dhoni into the cricketer we all know, or, as Chittu puts it, the only cricket coach Mahi has ever had. Chapter 3. The Portrait of a Cricketer as a Young Boy. It's been around 10 minutes since Chittu and I walked into the vast premises of the DAV school. Like the rest of the city, DAV is an interesting blend of now and then. The main school building itself is 2-story high. It's a modular concrete building with perforated screens and tiled roofs. What catches my eye, though, are the many open spaces around, not a sight that metro cities offer. The bracket-shaped building allows for plenty of space in the middle for the kids to indulge in a variety of activities. It also turns into a mini auditorium whenever their most famous alumnus shows up as chief guest for a function. The premises are big enough to have a number of gated entrances at various vantage points around the school. Our entry is through gate number 3. It's the month of May and it's the holiday season. But there is still some activity as kids walk in and out carrying their badminton rackets. The air is pleasanter here than outside, thanks to the handsome smattering of green on all sides. Around the back is where the cricket nets are. The sun has more or less set completely over the Mekong colony, but I still find a young man, a potential batting star in the making, according to my guide, Chittu, in full gear, facing throwdowns from another boy who looks younger than him. The setting is quiet enough for the thud of willow on leather to echo around the area. It's in the midst of this impressive display that I first come across Banerjee sir. I hear Banerjee sir before I see him. He's much older than his pictures suggest, but has retained a stable gait and a strong posture. There's every bit of the sports master about the man. I'm soon escorted to the school premises and a security guard is asked to unlock the door to the principal's office. He, the principal, like most of the kids, is away on vacation, so we can use his room, says Banerjee. I'm welcomed into a room with wooden showcases, chairs, and a wide desk, which is just so prototypically a principal's office that it gives me a few nostalgic shudders about the many visits that I have made to this esteemed section at my own school. Before we begin, he apologizes again for having kept me waiting. It is difficult to imagine Keshav Ranjan Banerjee having ever been a hard man when you look at him now. So, when he talks about the tough time he gave MS Dhoni and his school team after they lost a must-win game, I simply can't believe him, or maybe I don't want to. The story goes that DAV school were up against what their long-standing coach describes as a faltu, useless team in a league match. Dhoni was among the senior boys in the team and they ended up losing the match. It wasn't so much the loss that irked Banerjee. He recalls the boys having taken it a tad easy against the underdogs and being lackluster in their approach. I was irate. I was very upset too. As they walked off the field, I shouted at them, insisting that only the younger members of the team would be allowed to get onto the bus, and the senior boys, including Mahi, would have to walk back to the school or wherever they wanted to go. The bus would leave without them, Banerjee recalls. True to his word, the coach and the kids left with the bus, leaving Mahi and company stranded. The ground was in Harmu, where Dhoni now lives, which was a good 6 kilometers away from the school. It was a warm summer's day, and the boys had already felt the brunt of the unforgiving sun on the field. Still seething, but now slightly concerned about the boys, Banerjee waited at the school gate for the boys to return. Around half-hour later, he spotted them trundling up the road with Mahi in the lead. He still remembers Mahi's face all too vividly. It was placid as ever, and there was even a hint of a smile as he spotted his coach from a distance. I'm sure they took a lift. The ground was quite far. It was a punishment, but more importantly, I wanted them to realize what they had done. I wanted to see how they would react to this. Mahi didn't flinch or even have a frown on his face. Most kids will react, but he was the main player, and clearly he'd asked the rest to simply follow his lead. Nothing has changed about him even now, recalls Banerjee. Thinking back, The coach admits to having been a tad worried about the repercussions of his radical lesson on discipline. You never know. I was half expecting some Pitaji, a dad, to come and complain to me the next day, saying, "So what if they lost a game? How could you leave my son stranded and make him walk so far in the sun?" But nobody came. It was only much later that Banerjee found out through one of the boys that Mahi had told his teammates to keep the issue under wraps and not inform the parents. Of all the boys, he was the only one to realize exactly why I had not allowed them on the bus, Banerjee says with a smile. The way he would do over and over again as an international cricketer. Here, too, Dhoni had analyzed the situation in front of him with a calm mind. Instead of panicking, he had found a solution to it, hitching a ride and also ensuring that the purpose behind his coach's exercise wasn't wasted, which it would have been if even one of his teammates had informed the parents. Dhoni had learnt his lesson and along the way also revealed something vital about himself to Banerjee. Some 2 decades later, the coach recalls this incident as one of the prime reasons he's always felt with great conviction that Mahi hamesha sabse hatke tha or hamesha hatke rahega. Mahi was always different from everyone and will always remain so. He doesn't stop there. I come across nearly 4,000 to 5,000 kids a day at school. In my career, I've seen some 60,000 to 70,000 walk in through those gates, grow up in front of my eyes, and then walk out. But none have walked in like Mahi did, and none have walked out like he did, Banerjee asserts. Banerjee, sir, isn't an elusive man like Chittu. He was originally a sports teacher in Kolkata before shifting to Ranchi a year after Dhoni joined DAV in kindergarten. He does interviews quite often too, but he doesn't generally delve too deeply into a summation of his favorite student's personality. This is different though, he tells me. Mahi himself has given the go-ahead. Seated to my right, Chittu nods in agreement, followed by a reiteration. There are a lot of people who claim to have been responsible for the Mahi phenomenon. Some claim to be mentors, others claim to be coaches. But according to me and Mahi himself, he's had only one coach, and that's Sir, Chittu says, pointing at the elderly gentleman seated on the other side of the wooden desk. Banerjee flashes a shy smile in response and reveals with pride how his former pupil had told those making the Dhoni movie that there was only one man responsible for playing Cupid between him and cricket. The start of Dhoni's affair with cricket has been well documented over the years. Long before, Sushant Singh Rajput and Rajesh Sharma added a dollop of Bollywood flavour to how Banerjee transformed a football-crazy goalkeeper into the most successful wicketkeeper batsman in Indian cricket history. It had already become one of the most popular tales of sporting discoveries of our times. But the coach doesn't mind repeating it one more time for my benefit. Perhaps the most fascinating part of how Banerjee and Dhoni came across each other for the first time is how cliched it is. It's a scene played out almost every year in every school around the country. A desperate coach suddenly in need of some players as his main ones approach the dreaded black hole of their school sports careers, the 10th to 12th standard phase. Banerjee's need was dire. He needed to fill a vacancy that required a long-term candidate. DAV's wicketkeeper at that point happened to be in class 11 and with less than a year of school cricket left in him. Wicketkeepers are like good bassists for a metal band. They're difficult to find, and when you do find a good one, you never want to let him go. Banerjee didn't have much time left. Academics always got precedence over sport here, and once a kid was in 12th, khel kood band, no more sports. That's it. No questions asked. I couldn't just go and say, chhod ke aao, leave that and come. I was sick and tired of finding wicket-keepers in the 8th or 9th standards and then having to let them go after a couple of years. Mahi was in 6th then, and I just dragged him in. He was the perfect fit in so many ways, Banerjee says. There's an unbridled joy you see in Dhoni whenever he's involved in a game of football. It's different from what we get to see on the cricket field. He even reacts a lot more. He might finish off ODIs and T20s with the last over 6 and nonchalantly walk off like it's just business as usual, but he celebrates almost every goal he scores in the mandatory football matches that the Indian team indulges in at the start of every practice session. And you'll never see him miss out on any opportunity to show off his striking skills in the celebrity football matches that are usually played in Mumbai. Even back when Banerjee had turned him from goalkeeper to wicketkeeper, Dhoni's love for football didn't suffer. The coach recalls him playing football for the school regularly till around the 10th standard, and Banerjee never stopped him either. He used to have football shoes in his bag always, and when cricket practice would be called off due to heavy rains, he would go and play football. I never stopped him, like some coaches would say, No, you're a cricketer." Banerjee is an old-school coach in all other respects, though. He abhors the practice of parents carrying kit bags and accompanying their kids to practice. He doesn't appreciate them interfering in their children's sport. Before becoming a coach, he was a teacher. He always believed that kids needed to learn how to fend for themselves. If a child walks out of the school and his parents are waiting for him with the car, he won't learn anything. Let the kid walk to the school by himself rather than getting dropped off daily. If he gets late, he should know school में late आने से क्या punishment होती है. What punishment awaits him for being late? This is the struggle, Banerjee explains. He doesn't fear failure. It's no wonder that Banerjee saw in Dhoni a perfect fit. For it was not just when he graced the international arena that Dhoni became the foremost pragmatist of his generation. He'd always been one, as Coach Banerjee recalls. It helped that he also had a coach as pragmatic as he was. Banerjee insists that Dhoni embraced the struggle rather than fighting it or shying away from it. It's something he continues to do. It's not like they were ever short of money or food. Mahi's struggle was different. In those days, most kids didn't own their own kits. We had to manage. These days, Mummy, Papa will buy full flashy kit for their kids and they'll come, sit and watch them all day long. Those days, at the most you had your own water bottle. Mahi enjoyed the grind of becoming a sportsman. He thrived on it. Struggle se aadmi seekhta hai. A person learns through struggle. It teaches you to take decisions, says Banerjee. Another aspect of Dhoni's personality, one that has left the cricket world in awe, which impressed Banerjee rather early, was the ability to shake off every external element, including the trappings of fame, while he was in the middle. Mahi is still learning his craft. He never stops learning. Sometimes I see him and I am reminded of the 6th standard boy whom I met all those years ago. The eagerness to learn, which can be seen in his eyes, has never dimmed. Most kids at that age will play 1 or 2 tournaments, score a few runs here and there, and start showing off like they know everything there is to know about the sport. Mahi never showed off even then. Practice to practice, match to match. कोई दिक्कत नहीं है. If it's practice, it's going to be practice. Same with matches. No confusion. Dhoni brought the same attitude even to his academics. Though Banerjee wasn't ever directly involved with his star student studies, he remembers one visit to the Dhoni household very vividly. That was when Mahi's mother pulled up the coach and gave him a piece of her mind. She had some stern words for me, he says with a guffaw. She said, if his marks and studies suffer, I will not spare you. But Dhoni himself was never too stressed by the task of managing his cricket and studies. The term exam fever never existed in the Dhoni book, says the coach. Even during the exam season, if anyone was to call him for a match, Dhoni would write the exam and then go to play. And not just any exam, he did so even during his Class 12 exams. Banerjee still shakes his head in disbelief when he recalls one particular incident. With the mother's threat still very much in his mind, the shocked coach approached Mahi to find out if he was actually serious about going to Orissa to represent his club, Central Coal Limited, CCL, in a league match in between the board exams. I told him, this is not an internal exam that we can manage. These are your boards, beta. Aren't you worried? He said. Sir, pass ho jaunga main. I will pass. Don't worry. The board exam started at 10 a.m. DPS Ranchi was the center. 1 p.m. it finished. The CCL car was waiting for him from 11:30 itself with his kit and bag. He got out, changed from his school clothes, got into the car and headed straight to the station to take the train. You get a 2-day gap between papers during the boards. He returned after 2 days, started studying and went and took the exam the following day. Dhoni ended up scoring somewhere between 55 to 60% in his 12th standard exam, where commerce was his main subject. Incidentally, a lot of his friends who studied day and night say both Chittu and Banerjee fared no better. Mahi never stressed too much about studies. His sister would often go to one of his classmates' house to get his notes sorted since he had missed classes due to cricket, Banerjee reveals. Dhoni's style of studying, like every other aspect of him, was unique. The night before the exam, his sister would read the notes out aloud while he closed his eyes and listened. That was all he needed. Banerjee isn't too surprised about how Dhoni approaches run chasers in limited overs cricket. He's seen him employ the same cool as ice demeanor to the examinations he faced off the field. He realized that the more tense you are, the more nervous you get, and your performance gets affected. He employs the same mindset to everything in life. Exam and cricket ka funda are the same. If out ho gaye, to out. So why fret about it before it happens? He doesn't fear failure. That's where this innate confidence comes from, says Banerjee. And Dhoni's incredible self-confidence seems to have nothing to do with whether things were going his way or not. Banerjee remembers that his ward was as confident as ever even during some of the lowest points in his life. One of them came early in his career, just around the time he had started making a name for himself on the domestic circuit and had even earned a call-up to the national camp in Chandigarh. Back then, in 2001, Dhoni was competing against Deep Das Gupta and Ajay Ratra for a spot in the India A squad. A stint at the national camp alongside the best players in the country would have given him a vital first-hand glimpse at the level he was working so hard to reach. Unfortunately, Dhoni fractured his wrist and had to give the trip a miss. Banerjee found himself in the difficult position of checking on Mahi's morale and making sure that the youngster didn't take the blow too badly. I asked him, "Tum jaoge nahi? You won't go?" I couldn't say anything negative to him in that state. I was worried whether he'll get another chance. It's always tricky for a wicket-keeper, and that was the time India had found a number of them, some even younger than Mahi. But he was the one who told me, "Don't worry, sir. I know I'll get one more chance. You just wait and see, and I'll take that chance." That was the kind of unbelievable confidence he had in himself, Banerjee says, with a wide smile. An emotion that Banerjee claims to have never seen in Dhoni is that of anger or frustration. This, despite all the trials and tribulations he underwent before his star began to rise. There was the snub from the Mekong selectors, but that was not all. There was always an obstacle to overcome, and always a detractor to be proved wrong. But while Dhoni rode through them with as much equanimity as ever, it was often painful for his support crew, the likes of Chittu, Coach Banerjee, and Chotu Bhaiya. Whether it was with SAIL, CCL, Railways, Ranji, or India A, there was always some issue he had to deal with. I remember at South Eastern Railway, some players didn't want Mahi to bat higher up the order because they were scared he would score runs and progress past them. He already had a reputation of being a big hitter, but he never protested, chimes in Chittu, who had so far sat tending to the many messages on his two phones. Mahi's nature is that he doesn't do bad things to anybody. Even if someone wrongs him in any way, the worst Mahi will do is to stop talking to them. दूर रहता है, लेकिन बोलेगा नहीं कि तुम गलत हो. He stays away from them, but will never say they are wrong. If he gets angry, nobody can stand in front of him. It's true when they say those who get angry rarely are the scariest when they do. Luckily, only Sakshi and I get to see that side of him. Chittu laughs before holding his ears and shaking his head, with his tongue sticking out. Almost on cue, Chittu receives a call and excuses himself. He promises to meet me later that night to continue our exploration of the world of Mahi, and takes leave of Banerjee with a quick joke. Some guys are just talkative. Chittu is talkative, quips Banerjee as soon as his ex-student leaves the office. Then the topic slides back to Mahi without any prompting. Mahi was never talkative. He's a write the answer to the point kind of guy, shy, almost an introvert. He always preferred the outdoors though, and would make sure he sat next to a window in class. The primary class kids would be playing and he would keep observing them, says Banerjee. That would often be mistaken for daydreaming and was the only time Dhoni would be pulled up by a teacher. Those around him put it down to this insatiable need to observe and learn something new. I saw it for myself during IPL 2017 as he and Australian captain Steve Smith spent a good half hour grappling with a drone camera at the end of a practice session at the MCA Stadium in Pune. The first 15 minutes of fiddling was rather random, and not surprisingly, it was Dhoni, Mr. Gadget, to those around him who cracked the code and had the drone flying. I share this with Banerjee, and he cites an example of his own to highlight just how good Dhoni's power to grasp any new skill is. I had a scooter back in the day. I used to bring my son for practice those days. He was a little boy, and one day he got hit on the leg by a stray shot that went in his direction. He was crying and needed to be taken home. I couldn't leave the practice session. I asked Mahi if he would go. He agreed. "But I have a scooter. How will you go?" he said. "Give me the keys." I looked at him with a bemused look on my face and asked, "Sab chalana aata hai? Do you know to ride everything?" He replied, "Bike to aa gayi hai. Scooter bhi aa jayega. I know how to ride a bike. I'll figure out how to ride a scooter too." And just like that, he comfortably rode my scooter home. That was only through observing me all those years. To my knowledge, he had never ridden a scooter before. Dhoni's quiet yet affable nature also made him really popular in school and in the dressing room. He would never say much, but when he did, he would either have those around him in splits or make them sit up and notice. He would respect everyone, so he got respect back. That's the way he plays. खेल के respect लेने में and senior बोल के respect लेने में फर्क है. There's a difference in gaining respect through your game and gaining it by merely being a senior, says Banerjee. This was the time Dhoni started wearing full-sleeved shirts while keeping wickets. While the full sleeve invokes derisive looks on the field when it comes to a bowler, considering its association with bowlers with dodgy actions, in Dhoni's case, it was once again a practical move. There was one match in particular in Jamshedpur when the harsh sun and dry heat during the summer burnt the hair on his arms. It was to prevent this that Dhoni turned to covering his arms completely while behind the stumps, a practice that became a habit which continues to this day. Then there was a match in 1997 where Dhoni, a class 10 student, insisted on opening and got his way. It was the innings that Banerjee considers the turning point of his career. It was on an important day, an inter-school final. Dhoni ended up scoring an unbeaten 213 and shared a 378-run stand with Shabir Hussain for the first wicket. That was the innings which brought him his first professional contract with the CCL. But if Banerjee had had his way, it might not have turned out quite like that. The inter-school matches used to be played on matting, so opening was not a great idea for him. We preferred him at number 4 because that's where most runs came from in those matches. He would walk out by the 8th or the 9th over and the ball would have lost its shine. The ball would then keep low and allow him to hit fatafat, which was his style even back then. Plus, this was a final, so I was really worried, says Banerjee. But Dhoni was adamant, despite his coach warning him about the peril the team would be in if he made that one mistake against the moving ball and got out early. Eventually, upon realizing that Dhoni was going to have his way, Banerjee caved in, but only on one condition. "I will not make anyone pad up, not even the number 3. If you go there, you have to finish it." I wanted to change his playing habit. If you open, you have to change your style of playing. I don't even remember whether I stood by my word and stopped the number 3 from padding up. We didn't need him. Those two finished off the run chase without losing a wicket, says Banerjee. That was the turning point. I just sat on the sidelines and watched in amazement. That innings proved to me that he'll play for India. Banerjee's eyes twinkle as if he can still see it in front of his eyes 2 decades later. Banerjee, incidentally, wasn't the only one at DAV to foresee the superhuman rise of Dhoni. There was someone else too, and she wasn't even at the ground to witness that blitzkrieg. She was one of Dhoni's classmates. Banerjee still sounds flabbergasted while talking about her. I had gone to his class to call him for a match. The teachers would create a fuss if I sent another kid. It was an accounts lecture in 11th or 12th standard. The teacher in class that day was Sharmishtha Kumar, who taught business and accounts. Later, in the staff room, it was Kumar who would tell Banerjee about her encounter with the unlikely Nostradamus. So, apparently, as soon as Mahi and I left, one girl suddenly got up and said, "Ma'am, don't let him go. Take his autograph before you let him go. You won't get it later on." I told her, but who knows when or if he'll play for India. Later on, when Mahi was picked for India, one of the first people I thought of was that girl who foresaw his rise before anyone else, says Banerjee. I wondered aloud whether Banerjee sir would have even noticed Dhoni if he wasn't a sportsman, that is, considering his unassuming disposition. The veteran coach almost dismisses the thought, saying he couldn't ever picture Mahi as a non-sportsman, since that's all he saw the boy doing from the first time they met, play sport. We are interrupted a couple of times as the peon knocks on the door asking for the keys to the badminton court. It is summer camp time and the kids training for badminton have arrived for the evening session. The mention of the badminton court immediately evokes more Mahi talk. He obviously can't come as often as before, but whenever he does, I know the only place in school that he wants to visit. That's the badminton court. So we lock the whole premises and sneak him in. Chittu or one of his other friends will show up and he'll be on the court for hours, says the coach. Dhoni was the head boy of the school in the sports category for a couple of years, but Banerjee says he could have been the overall head boy too. Such was his reputation. And Sharmishta Kumar, the accounts teacher, agrees. In an interview to the Telegraph, she had said he spent a lot of time on the field playing cricket, and when he came to class, I used to ask him, "My God, Dhoni, you have missed so many classes. What will you do now?" And he used to say, "Ma'am, you tell me how I can cope with my studies and my cricket given the limited time." Any teacher was ready to help him because he was so polite and humble. She had also spoken about how all the teachers had pitched in to help Dhoni clear his final examination and praised him for being a kid who never indulged in gossip. What also endeared Mahi to his school teammates was his willingness to go the extra mile to ensure his team did well in every tournament it participated in. At times, it meant double duty for him, as by then he had already started playing for the CCL in the 1997-98 season. And on the days when school and club matches clashed, there would often be a mini tug-of-war between the coaches of both teams. The CCL would obviously get its way since Dhoni was a professional there, even as Banerjee tried everything to get his way. Our school team depended totally on 4 or 5 players, including Mahi. We used to manage somehow without him. There was one situation when there was an important match for both teams on the same day. The CCL secretary was the district secretary. I requested him to let go of Mahi. I told him they have other big players in their office team. But not having Mahi leaves a huge hole in my team. "Jaane dijiye use, leave him for us." He said no, we can't play without him. Then I asked Mahi. He said, "Haan, hum khelenge. Yes, I'll play if the school match is pushed back by a day." I said, "Lekin 2 days mein 2 matches in this heat?" He said, "3 khel lunga, sir. I can play 3, sir." Unlike with club matches, playing for the school meant carrying your team kit, etc. And if you got injured, the first aid had to be done by yourself. But Dhoni never made a fuss. And the fact that his team won more often than not when he was around only added to his growing popularity. That Dhoni has managed to maintain his humility throughout doesn't surprise Banerjee. The two meet often whenever the superstar is in town, and the coach has visited his pupil's house on a few occasions. The junior Banerjee, whom Dhoni had scootered home as a teenager, is close to him and gushes about his Mahi Bhaiya. The coach says they share mutual respect, and despite Dhoni's meteoric rise, the equation between the two has not changed. A lot of people tell me, Dhoni se mangte kyun nahi ho? Money and gifts. Why don't you ask Dhoni for money and gifts? A student-teacher relation is very different. Guru dakshina nahi पूछना चाहिए. A guru should not ask for any offering from his disciple. The only thing I ask of him is to keep performing at his best, or, at times, to win the World Cup, says Banerjee. The coach believes that his ward has not made too many changes to his game. There was one particular quirk in his wicket-keeping that still amuses Banerjee, but we'll come to that later in another chapter. The swivel hook and the cross-batted slog that Dhoni has mastered over the years come naturally to him, says the one who has seen the man at close quarters since his school days. As for Dhoni's innate sense to pick length and his hawk-like hand-eye coordination, the coach puts that down to batting a lot on the ground next to the school gate. There are small and big stones on that ground. There was no point in removing all the stones. It would have taken forever. So we would put a mat on top of those stones and play. You could never be sure how the ball would behave. One would come to your ankles while the next would fly past your ear, recalls Banerjee. So when Dhoni would practice his batting on this ungainly and awkward surface, he would simply focus on playing across the line. He would play a hook or pull shot to every ball that came his way. If it stayed low, he hooked it. If it rose high, he hooked it, Banerjee relates laughingly. That's how he broke all the window panes on that one side of the school, and I was summoned routinely to the same room we're sitting right now by the principal. While in international cricket, bowlers are more often than not bowling short of a length intentionally to thwart Dhoni's attacking prowess. It was while contending with this pinball board-like surface that the right-hander developed the ability to react to the ball rather than focus on any other factor around. As regards the power his disciple generates, Banerjee puts it down to his Pahari origins. He always had powerful arms. Pahari people are generally strong mentally and physically. They're used to going up and down the hill trail, and in Mahi's case, wo khata bhi bahut tha. He used to eat a lot. Back then, he would eat whatever he got. Now, he's a Raja. He can eat whatever he wants. Dildar hai khane mein. He has a voracious appetite. Chittu says that's no longer the case. आजकल तो सिर्फ grilled chicken खाता रहता है. These days, he only eats grilled chicken. He wants to play that 2019 World Cup, and he's ready to do anything for that. He's the fittest that I've ever seen, he says. Chittu too says that food has always played an important role in Dhoni's life. It was very simple for Mahi. The days his team won anything, he would celebrate it with chicken. He loves chicken, says Chittu. Dhoni's Twitter profile says that he is perennially hungry for chicken butter masala. Chittu recalls the morning when Dhoni was selected to the Indian team for the first time. Dhoni was in Jamshedpur and he arrived at around 8:30 a.m. with mithai. Then he picked up all his friends in the black Scorpio that had by then become synonymous with him around Ranchi, and off they went to the all-day dhaba on the outskirts, which had always been their traditional late-night haunt. There are no prizes for guessing what the order was. Chicken butter masala, of course, says Chittu. Now, there was only one more person in Dhoni's inner circle that I had to meet, Chotu Bhaiya. We were to meet the next afternoon at a common spot before he took me to his now famous sports goods shop, Prime Sports, on his bike. Chotu Bhaiya picked me up from our preordained spot and off we went. But before we could get there, he suddenly stopped the bike, turned around and started laughing. Slightly taken aback, but still taken in by his boisterous and infectious laugh, I too joined in, albeit with a puzzled look on my face. Noticing my obvious bewilderment, he said, "Are, I never thought I would be taking around a long-haired guy on a bike around Ranchi again. And that too, a guy who's come to write a book on our Mahi." Chapter 4, Prime Time. Ravindra Jadeja recently revealed that Dhoni owns 43 or 44 bikes. It's not his fault that he couldn't come up with a precise number. For, according to the all-rounder, Dhoni himself often loses count of how many vaunted two-wheelers there are in his garage. A couple of years ago, Dhoni's vehicular worth was set at 23 bikes and 10 cars, and the collection included brands that the average Indian hears of only in the movies: Ducati, Harley-Davidson, and even one that sounds and looks like something that Batman would own, the Confederate X-132 Hellcat. Chotu Bhaiya, though, remembers Mahi knocking on his door one morning and asking whether he would lend him his RX-100, India's own racer bike from the 1990s. Dhoni then didn't have a bike of his own. The two first met at the Royal Club in 1995, where Chotu was a senior player and Dhoni the talented upstart. Since Chotu had a bike which he'd bought a year earlier, the coach had requested him to pick up and drop the shy and quiet kid from his home inside the Mekong colony. It was during these bike rides, despite lengthy periods of silence, says Chotu, that the two began developing a unique bond. His friends were going to Hazaribagh, known for its sanctuary and forests, on a biking trip. But they were leaving Mahi behind since he didn't own a bike. He came to me and said, "Bhaiya, bike dena please." He recalls, Hazaribagh is a 95-kilometer, 3-hour ride from Ranchi. While Chotu had no qualms about lending the bike, considering how well-versed Mahi was with riding it, there was one issue. The lights weren't working for some reason. I asked him to take the bike but return before sunset since it would be risky without the lights. He said, "Don't worry, I'll be back before it gets dark." They, of course, didn't return before 11 or 12 in the night, and I and a friend nearly went half the distance looking for them, he says. And Chotu wasn't surprised to find Mahi comfortably gliding on the empty roads more confidently than those with perfectly working headlights. The tension, as always, was all mine. He looked as cool as ever, he adds. While Dhoni's chaska liking for two-wheeler rides is well documented, it was on Chotu's RX-100 that he first indulged in it before he could afford one himself. It was also this RX-100 that witnessed the coming together of two people who became really close friends, who have never let the age difference come in the way. Chotu says, "Chaska to pehle se tha, lekin bike se pyar meri RX-100 pe hi hua." He had this liking for bikes, but it all began on my RX-100. History repeated itself a couple of years ago, as Dhoni, though not quite directly, came asking for Chotu's RX-100 again. It was the Dhoni filmmakers who wanted to borrow it, and once again Chotu readily handed over his prized possession. The lights were in working condition this time around. Chotu pauses suddenly and then informs me that I too had just become a part of history. "Sir, the bike that I picked you up on is that exact same RX-100, he says with a hearty laugh. Mahi's first bike was an RX-135, a more powerful bike than mine, but he never got to ride it much and sold it off rather early, Chotu adds. For the record, Dhoni had tweeted a picture of what he called his first bike, a Rajdoot, which he got restored in 2013. But I'm nobody to challenge Chotu Bhaiya's version of Mahi's history with two-wheelers. Then came the fancy bikes, one after the other. There was also the Batmobile on two wheels. Chittu, not much of a biker himself, shares another biking tale. Once he was allowed to ride one of Dhoni's high-end bikes, but unfortunately he fell down with it. After the incident, Chittu remembers approaching Dhoni ashen-faced and embarrassed. But the first thing he said was, "तुमको चोट नहीं लगी ना? Bike तो बन जाएगी. You are not hurt, right? The bike can be fixed." That's supposed to be another instance, and there were many I heard in Ranchi, of how Dhoni still remains rooted and cares for the people who've stuck with him on this amazing ride. Chittu hasn't joined us for this midday chat near the busy Sujata Chowk, which is abuzz with people and activity. Prime Sports is the kind of sports goods store that has more or less gone extinct in cities like Mumbai and Delhi. You might find the odd mom-and-pop version of a sports store still standing in the suburbs, but most of urban India has moved on to the decathlons of the world. Prime Sports is a throwback to the 1990s, when sports goods stores were like any other, where the customer stood on one side of the counter and trusted the shopkeeper to get exactly what was needed. There was no question of self-service. The cramped space inside Prime is packed with boxes and cartons stacked on top of each other, while the glass shelves are filled with sundry items, including a number of unmarked trophies for sale. Again, things that you don't get to see in modern-day sports stores. Prime Sports, which Chotu owns, is also an unofficial shrine to a man who once spent many hours within its confines. The side shelf, the one facing the busy road, is filled with screenshots of Dhoni's first foray into Indian cricket's public consciousness. His brutal exploits on an India A tour to Kenya, which included the 2 centuries against Pakistan A, which propelled him to the national team in 3 months' time. Chotu happily provides a guided tour to all corners and does it every bit like a museum curator, to the extent of corroborating every anecdote about Mahi with corresponding pictures or newspaper cuttings, right from the time he was anonymous, even in Ranchi, to becoming one of the most well-known faces in Indian sport around the world. The first picture he points to is of a fresh-faced Dhoni looking rather pleased with his brand-new sweater and wicket-keeping gloves. It's from the morning of his Ranji Trophy debut for Bihar at the Mekong Stadium on 12th January 2000 against Assam. The Dhoni journey is surreal at various levels. I tell Chotu about how Dhoni's face has hardly changed, and the hair is a lot like how it is now without being stylized. Sir, आदमी change नहीं हुआ है. Face कैसे change होगा? Sir, when the man himself has not changed, how can his face? He shoots back, laughing. There's another one next to that picture. Dhoni in a Manchester United jersey. Not surprising, considering that's the EPL team he still supports passionately, posing with some teammates. Chotu tells me it's from a trip to Himachal Pradesh with the Jharkhand team a few years later. Later, he shows a more recent poster of Dhoni, looking older and grizzled. Look at the greys. This had to happen. Being Indian captain means tension and stress, even for the coolest man on the field, I say. But I'm immediately corrected by Chotu. Nahi, no tension for Mahi. The safed bal, white hair and dadi, beard is more due to all the playing in the sun. He spent more than half his life under the sun. Once more, I'm in no position to argue with him. As I look around, I'm rather taken aback by the fact that Chotu hasn't moved out of this rather aging establishment into a more plush setting. I'm further intrigued to learn that he's not even keen on moving. Things have changed for sure. There's so much more competition nowadays. I've been running this right here for 22 years. I've stayed loyal to one brand, BAS, Beat All Sports, throughout, and I don't consider myself a very ambitious person, he explains. It was this loyalty to BAS that helped Chotu win the maiden sponsorship deal for his friend. Dhoni didn't play for the Royal Club for more than a season and soon started making a name for himself in school cricket and for the CCL on the club scene. And his name started appearing routinely in the local newspapers. The friend, an entrepreneur in Chotu, thought this was the right time to invest in this budding talent. I used to sit at BAS company back then in Jalandhar with Mr. Kohli, the owner. I told him once, "Uncle, I have a player who is needy and doesn't even have the money to buy his own kit. Anyway, you are sponsoring 2 kits. Just help this boy out too. Naam hai MS Dhoni." But he wasn't convinced. He said, "Itni jaldi kaise hoga? How can this be done so quickly?" But Chotu wasn't one to give up so easily. A few days later, he was back in Mr. Kohli's office with the same request. Bahut aage piche hua, and then he kind of agreed. After a lot of back and forth, he finally agreed. I rushed back and told Mahi that a company is ready to sponsor him and made him prepare a CV. I went back to Jalandhar and said, "Paji, please give the kit today. He has a match in 2 days." He looked back and said, "2 days na? Chalo, we'll see." I started shaking my head and said, "Did I say 2 days? I meant tomorrow," Chotu says, followed by that laugh again. He returned after receiving a guarantee that the kit would be couriered soon, despite multiple requests from him for it to be handed to him then and there. The deal wasn't sealed yet, and by the time Chotu was back in Ranchi, Dhoni had been picked up in the Bihar squad for his Ranji debut. Another round of frantic calls ensued, with Chotu screaming, "Now his name has come in the Ranji squad. Ab to saman bhej do. Now, please send the kit." It was only on the eve of the match that Dhoni's first ever kit arrived at his then home N171 in the Mekong colony. Chotu then points again to the picture with Dhoni in his BAS sweater. The two had hit it off long before the BAS deal. The bike rides from the practice sessions soon got extended to Dhoni spending most of his free time at Prime Sports and playing badminton at the railway stadium once Chotu shut shop for the day. Thus, Prime Sports became MS Dhoni's Adda. Chotu opened the shop around 1994 while he was still a player, and in those days was juggling the twin roles of a cricketer and a businessman. This was during his CCL days. I used to close the shop by 8 p.m. We would then go and play badminton till 10 p.m. Then I would drop him off at his place and head home. Around 7 a.m. I would pick him up again and drop him off for the CCL training. Around 10 to 11 a.m. he would finish practice and come to me and just sit there, he says, pointing at the seat I'm presently occupying. We have a customer at hand. It's a young boy, not more than 15, who wants a Costco tennis ball and a pair of gloves. As they are all in the cartons and boxes next to me, I turn helper under Chotu's instructions. I lift one here, move one there, shift myself, shift the chair, push the desk a little, and finally, to Chotu's relief, find the exact 2 boxes he's looking for. The transaction takes place rapidly, no questions asked. Chotu knows exactly what size and what brand of gloves the boy needs. Did Mahi help while he used to sit here? I ask, rather confidently, assuming that by helping him out a little, I had provided Chotu a Mahi throwback moment for the second time in a few hours. He looks at me funnily and replies, "Sir, his presence was enough." There's that Ranchi reverence again for their beloved son of the soil. At that point, Chotu Bhaiya starts laughing again. To my embarrassment, he spotted that my footwear is mismatched, a slipper and a floater, which I thought I'd smartly hidden from his view. माही के साथ रह के हम भी सब कुछ ऑब्जर्व करना सीख गए शायद. In Dhoni's company, perhaps I too have learned to observe everything, he explains. To accentuate his admiration for Dhoni's observational skills, which seem to have had a lasting impact on everyone who has met him, Chotu gives his own version of how his friend could spot his shy father watching him bat. Amazingly, he recalls Dhoni having done so even on his Ranji debut. His nazar, eye, is all around, even when he's on the ground. I'm sure he can even spot things that happen in the crowd in the biggest stadiums in the world and even remember a few faces. On his Ranji debut, when he was batting, Dhoni made 40 and 68 not out in that game. His father, as usual, was peeping through one of those grooves on the boundary wall, and he spotted his father in spite of the pressure of playing his first high-level knock. Chotu recalls, "You almost want to believe this to be true." And according to his inner circle, it's not just a quirk. They insist that Dhoni's knack for observation makes him a great judge of people. आदमी तुरंत और अच्छे से परख लेता है. He reads people quickly and correctly, says Chotu. This quality of gauging a person and his credentials has come to the fore on the cricket field quite often. The Joginder Sharma example, of course, stands out when on that famous night in Johannesburg in 2007, Dhoni handed the inexperienced medium pacer the final over in the grand finale against Pakistan, a move that shocked the world and also eventually made India the first ever world champions in T20 cricket. In interviews, Sharma would reveal that Dhoni not only said he would take responsibility for the decision if things went rogue, but also told the young nobody that he had 6 balls to create history. Others around the team management would, in later years, emphasize that it wasn't a gut feel move, but one that Dhoni had discussed earlier due to various factors, which included Sharma's ability to bowl a good Yorker as well as his inherent poker face. He made Joginder's life. Everyone was underestimating him, but Mahi lifted him, Chotu says, and then with a smile adds, "Your life will also change because of this book. Just wait and watch." There have, of course, been series after series of such out-of-the-box calls that Dhoni has made in his career, many of which we'll deal with in another chapter. And while not all have been successful, they have each had the inimitable Dhoni touch. Even the times when he brought himself on to bowl that one over, like at the Champions Trophy in 2009 or before the lunch break at Lord's in 2011, just to give an unsubtle hint to the selectors about the bowling options they had given him. It comes through even in his relationships. Chittu explains, "सामने से कौन आ रहा है, क्यों आ रहा है, सब पता है. He knows who's coming, why they're coming, everything. Nobody can escape Mahi's gaze. It's the same for me as well. He'll know exactly why I have come to meet him just by looking at me. Say, I have come with a contract that needs to be signed or to introduce someone to him, but I'm hesitating or talking about something else. He'll smile and say, bol de, dil mein mat rakh. Tell, don't keep it in your heart." Now, Chotu goes on to sound like a mix of a forlorn lover and a doting parent. "वो दिन भर मेरे साथ ही रहता है, वहां पर है लेकिन मेरे साथ है. नहीं लगता है कि वो अलग है. He's always here with me. He may be anywhere, but he's with me. I don't feel that he's separate from me. While Dhoni's relations with Narendra, his elder sibling, have always been a subject of conjecture, so much so that even those around him talk about it only in hushed tones and prefer not saying much even then, Chotu had actually stood in as the bhaiya quite often in the early days, and he sounds like one even now. It's not like we talk to each other often. We don't have to. We are one. He has no time now, and I totally get that. But when he's in town, I'll know, and we'll certainly try and meet, he says. There was, of course, the famous Agartala episode in January 2001, where Dhoni was picked for the first time in the East Zone squad to play the Deodhar Trophy against South Zone. But Dhoni was blissfully unaware of his selection. It was only when Chotu paid a routine visit to his friend, the Railways player Subra Sarkar's house the evening before the East Zone team was scheduled to fly out from Kolkata that the news sprang upon them. Chotu never tires of narrating the episode. I had just returned from one of my Jalandhar visits. BAS had launched a new wheel-wala kit bag. I went to collect it from a friend's place which was near Sarkar's house. Mahi's selection for East Zone had only appeared in the Bengali paper that Sarkar's father would get at home. As soon as I entered, his father said, "Mahi knows he's been picked to go to Agartala, right?" I said, "No, uncle, he doesn't." The last train to Kolkata had already left. Panic calls to the Bihar Cricket Association, BCA, and the CCL didn't yield much, and Chotu decided to hire a Tata Sumo that very night and leave for Kolkata with Dhoni and Gautam Gupta, who would later on become Dhoni's brother-in-law after marrying his elder sister Jayanti, for company. The car broke down during the middle of the night, causing a 3-hour delay. And to make matters worse, they were delayed an extra hour after being stopped by the state police for checking. That last delay meant that they couldn't make it on time for the flight. Dhoni eventually had to take a flight later in the day, which allowed Deep Dasgupta to don the gloves. Dhoni spent the match on the bench. Dasgupta managed scores of 0 and 32 not out against a power-packed South Zone attack, which included Javagal Srinath, Venkatesh Prasad and Sunil Joshi, all India regulars at that point. This was January 2001, and there are those who believe that missing the flight to Agartala delayed Dhoni's entry into international cricket by a few years, allowing Dasgupta to pip him to the post. At that stage of his career, Dhoni had appeared in 9 first-class matches and had an average of 34.14. We can never say for sure how he would have fared against the likes of Srinath and Prasad at that nascent stage of his career and the impact it would have left on him. The fact that he seemed so primed for international cricket when he did make it nearly 4 years later proves that the timing of his entry too was just perfect. Maybe 2001 wasn't meant to be his time for a reason. Dasgupta did keep his place despite his failures against South Zone to face West Zone, which again had an attack comprising Ajit Agarkar and Zahir Khan. He made scores of 2 and 0 while Dhoni watched from the sidelines, elated, as many of his friends say, to just share the same field as his idol, Sachin Tendulkar. उस रात हमारा बंदा सही जगह पहुंच नहीं पाया, लेकिन आखिर में सही जगह पहुंच ही गया लाइफ में. That night, our man was not able to reach the right place, but eventually he did reach the right place in life. Chotu Bhaiya couldn't have put it better. Chotu also recalls having experienced an epiphanic moment of Nostradamus proportions during a school league match at the Ranchi College ground. He had two friends for company, though he isn't sure whether they felt the same way he did. It wasn't a blazing knock or even one of those trademark Dhoni bludgeons that convinced Chotu that his pillion rider was made for greatness. It was Dhoni, the wicketkeeper, that prompted the prediction. It was a catch down the leg side he took off a fast bowler. It was a great catch where he moved quickly and took it despite being blindsided. मेरे दिल से तभी निकला कि ये एक दिन इंडिया के लिए खेलेगा. It came from my heart then that this guy would play for India one day. My friends were taken aback, and then I remember him taking a similar catch during the last World Cup, and I was like, ये तो हम देखे थे और बोले भी थे. I had seen this before and spoken about it, Chotu says with a sense of great pride. The India A tour to Kenya in 2004 is correctly identified as the tipping point for Dhoni's graduation to international cricket. This was one of the first A series to be shown live on TV back home. It couldn't have been timelier. At that point, fringe players didn't quite get the same number of A tours to show off their skills as they do now. A-tour performances were what you heard about and bothered to read about if you were a scrupulously keen follower of the game. And so, India got to witness Dhoni's unique repertoire of breathtaking strokes rather than just read about his 2 centuries in the scorecard a day later. It also helped Chotu start a tradition of his own. He started taping all of Dhoni's exploits using a VCR on one of those big cassettes, as he puts it. He did it on the same small-screen TV that he still claims to keep in his shop. But wait, the TV is still here? I ask. And that sets me up for the big reveal. I picture it being part of Chotu Bhaiya's usual routine where he coaxes his audience into a discussion about Dhoni's India A blitzes and then springs on them the TV trick. He's still laughing as he begins moving a few cartons in front of the counter before pushing back his own tiny desk and opening a shelf which faces inward and away from the road, making it completely hidden from view. I wonder whether it always requires such elaborate shifting or it's just part of the show. The drama is totally worth it. He even has to move some of the apparel, a few t-shirts and a couple of shorts for the 12-inch TV to be finally revealed. So clandestine is the location that Q of James Bond fame might be proud of it. I don't like going to the ground to watch games. I prefer it right here on this old TV, but I always watch it on mute, and because of its location, nobody outside can ever make out I'm watching TV, and that too, a cricket match, he says. Chotu remembers having asked Dhoni for 2 gifts from Kenya, 2 centuries, preferably against Pakistan, which is exactly what his friend got him. In return, Chotu played the perfect elder sibling, recording the entire innings and then taking TV grabs and sticking them up for display all around his enterprise. While describing some of Dhoni's shots from those knocks, Chotu gets up and cleans the photos with a cloth and a lot of care. It's something that he has to do often, considering the proximity to the bustling and dusty Sujata Chowk. He also has thousands of newspaper clippings dating back from 1995-96. You're the real Dhoni chronicler, I tell him. Chotu smiles. Dhoni had crossed single figures only once in his first 3 ODI innings. So, when India met Pakistan in the second ODI in Vizag on 5th April 2005, India's new wicketkeeper had a lot to prove. Dhoni had batted at number 7 in all those previous innings. That morning, Chotu paid a visit to his Gurudwara. I prayed, Babaji, aaj iska test hai. Babaji, today he has a test. If Mahi comes up the order today, he'll make it count. When Chotu came back to the shop and switched on his trusted TV, Sachin Tendulkar was walking back to run out for just two, and in walked Dhoni. His first scoring shot was a punch drive on the up off Mohammad Sami that went between bowler and mid-off for four. It's an area of the ground where he rarely scores, but it was a shot that had both oomph and a touch of arrogance. I saw that boundary and thought, today he'll score a century. His career hasn't looked back since that boundary, recalls Chotu about the 123-ball 148 that set the Dhoni career off with a bang. It only got better a day later as Dhoni returned to great fanfare in his hometown and celebrated what would be the first of many epoch-defining feats with his core group of Chittu, Chotu and Gautamda over dinner at their favourite dhaba. Yes, the dhabe mein khane wala had made it big but not forgotten his roots. Chotu and Greg Chappell share something in common. They both predicted that Dhoni would become Indian captain long before anyone even imagined him as a candidate or even thought of it as a probability. While Chappell would famously declare this during a selection meeting, Chotu would shock those around him with the same claim. But somehow, and here's where the protectiveness of being a bhaiya kicks in, Chotu says he was suspicious of the motives behind naming Dhoni as the Indian captain for the inaugural World T20. This is a common thread you see with the Ranchi folk, a prevailing sense of suspicion over a lot of decisions taken around their friends and idol. It's perhaps a small-town thing, this near paranoia, but in Dhoni's context, their distrust is just another extension of their genuine concern for him. A lot of people were after him. They made him captain within 2 years for a reason. There's a conspiracy behind it, we thought then. T20 was considered a random format back then, and they thought, make him captain. He won't do well and we can get rid of him from the team itself. Chotu spells out the conspiracy. Not that it affected his confidence about Dhoni overcoming even this unlikely challenge. I knew he would do well and win the World T20. Those who dig a hole for others fall into it themselves. That fact will always remain. He has never done bad things to anyone. He kept doing his thing and continued to give it his best, even today, he adds. The World T20 victory changed Dhoni's profile around India and especially in Ranchi. He could no longer make visits to prime spots without the entire road being cordoned off. And with time, he and Chotu Bhaiya began to drift apart, only physically though, as I'm told repeatedly. Chotu recalls having given a young Dhoni only one piece of cricketing advice: stay at the crease and the runs will always come to you. I bring up the subject of the elder brother role that he has been playing in Dhoni's life, and Chotu sheepishly tells me, by the time I could give him any life advice, he'd grown too big for me, in stature anyway. The common perception about Dhoni in many circles is that he doesn't let anyone get too close to him. Chotu disagrees. Whoever is with him for life. Funnily enough, these days Dhoni plays bhaiya to Chotu's 11-year-old son, Simar Singh. But before we get to that, I'm shown a video of young Simar batting on a local ground. The feet are moving well, I observe. Pat comes the reply from the father. Haath nahi theek aa raha hai. The hands are not moving correctly. It's been 4 months now. When the Singhs do visit the Dhoni household, cricket, as always, is off the menu. Simar, though, is allowed a few indulgences. He goes there and plays cards with Mahi and his wife. Chotu says, "Badi kam umar mein sikha diya hai aapne use? Haven't you taught him to play cards at too young an age?" I say, and he replies, "Sir, he's not only learnt it on his own, He's also taught Mahi and Sakshi those card games. Cricket rarely features in conversations involving Chittu, Chotu and Mahi. That's been the case right from the school days. Both his closest confidants admit. There are enough common interests otherwise to keep them distracted from bats and balls. I'm repeatedly subjected to one of them during my visit to Prime Sports. As we are talking, Chotu Bhaiya has sent his apprentice on a number of occasions to get chai. At times, the tea is accompanied by biscuits and pastries. Whenever the three of us are together, there'll be lots of chai and lots of comedy. Before he became a star, we never talked cricket. Now he's a superstar and we still don't talk cricket. वो खेल रहा है और हम हमारा काम कर रहे हैं. He's playing and we are doing our own thing. It's a simple equation, says Chotu. He too then brings up the McDowell's #1 soda ad featuring him and Chittu, though not as gushingly as his partner in crime, and mentions the chai scene in it. This is about Dhoni complaining about Chittu's sugarless tea and how he himself makes the best chai among all the three. This had been a running gag among them for years now. Chittu had insisted that Dhoni's simplicity came through in the ad too, while he speaks about sipping Chittu's kharab, bad chai. Even when you give him a cup of tea, if there's slightly less sugar, he'll drink it. But once he's done, he'll say, थोड़ी चीनी कम था. पहले नहीं बोलेगा, last में बोलेगा. The sugar was less. He won't say it at first, but only at the end, Chittu had said. Like with Chittu, Chotu Bhaiya too understands his role very clearly in the Dhoni journey and how it's changed with time despite their relationship remaining the same. This is the main reason they've managed to stay so close to this complex enigma in a simple avatar. And one of Dhoni's characteristics they both harp on is that he never forgets those who have helped him. But at the same time, we never expected anything in return. We realized that we were just playing our roles in this special journey. None of us who have remained close to him did it with any other intention. It was always unconditional. All I did was introduce him to BAS. They helped him. ये आगे पहुंच गया, कंपनी का भी अच्छा हो गया, MS का भी अच्छा हो गया, और हमारा भी अच्छा हो गया. He went ahead, the company benefited, MS benefited, and we too benefited, Chotu quips. He then thinks back to those multiple bike rides and sums up, like everyone who's been part of the whole Dhoni journey does, that the man has overall remained the same. Chotu recalls how you could never make out whether he had had a good day or a bad one based on his demeanor. He would just be there sitting quietly. On and off, he would say something, but his focus was always only on his game. It's this incredible and distinctive equanimity of his friend that Chotu believes will keep their friendship going the same way it always has. वो रन मारे तब मेरे साथ होगा, जब नहीं मारेगा तब भी मेरे साथ होगा. If he scores runs, he's with us. If he doesn't, he's still with us. It was the same in his school days. तभी भी मेरा दोस्त था, आज इंडिया के लिए खेल रहा है, अभी भी मेरा दोस्त है. Then too he was my friend, and now that he's playing for India, he still remains my friend. Dhoni's love for Ranchi is one reason Chotu is confident. No, this is not one of his predictions that it'll be like the old days all over again once his playing days are over. I don't think he'll ever leave Ranchi and go. Finally, he'll have time for us again once he decides to retire. That part will never change. महल में रहना भी पता है और छोटे से कमरे में भी. जब नहीं था वैसे ही था, जब बहुत है वैसा ही है. He knows how to live in a palace and also in a small room. When he didn't have anything, he was like that. Now, when he has a lot, he's still like that. That's Mahi. Chapter 5. The Fauji Captain. On the morning of 17th March 2017, the Jharkhand one-day team had to hastily evacuate ITC Welcome, a five-star hotel in Delhi's Dwarka area. The players were having breakfast when they suddenly encountered thick smoke emanating from a fire that had broken out in one part of the property. There was understandable panic in the restaurant area, but one member of the Jharkhand team was in Delhi for the Vijay Hazare Trophy 50-over domestic tournament, was in a strange way feeling exhilarated. It was he who took charge of the evacuation procedure, coolly and calmly asking his teammates to not go hunting for their mobile phones and instead assemble at a particular spot before getting out safely. This wasn't MS Dhoni in his Captain Cool avatar. This was Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Mahendra Singh Dhoni from the 106 Parachute Regiment of the Territorial Army, leading his troops towards safety in a perilous mission. Thankfully, the Jharkhand team escaped unscathed, but their match had to be postponed since their kit bags were stuck inside the hotel. A few days later, Dhoni would recount the incident with great excitement to Colonel Vembu Shankar, his close army associate and dear friend. The hotel fire was, after all, exactly the kind of crisis scenario that the two would often discuss dealing with. In these discussions, they often imagined Dhoni making a quick escape through kitchens and secret doors to avoid the mob eagerly awaiting an opportunity to catch a glimpse of him in every hotel lobby around the country, and at times even overseas. As Colonel Shankar reveals, there would be a very obvious spring in his friend's stride as they would reach Dhoni's car parked in an undisclosed section of the hotel through a dark alley. In these brief yet thrilling moments, he would get to play the one role that he's most desperately wanted to in life, and one that's unlikely to ever come his way. MS Dhoni, the Fauji. Most of his exit routes would involve some part of the basement with no phone signal, and even as we would be guided out by one of the hotel staff, he would ask, "Abhi kuch ho gaya to kaise niklenge? If something happens now, how will we escape?" His mind is always working at how we can improvise and react to emergency situations. He was quite thrilled about having taken charge during that Delhi fire incident, Colonel Shankar says. The Colonel, himself a Gallantry Award winner who has now retired, isn't the only Dhoni confidant who insists that wo dil dimag se pura Fauji hai. He's a complete soldier in heart and mind. Colonel Shankar goes on to say that if he'd been in the army, Dhoni would have made a great leader, even if he didn't rise to being a general or a brigadier, because, as he explains, MS is not too great at long-distance running, and I'm not sure if he would have had an interest in the studies needed to finish courses and rise through the ranks. But Colonel Shankar is confident that Dhoni would have led good and successful operations and been a great leader to those serving under him. He points to the Delhi fire incident again as an example. Such thinking at a juncture of adversity is what a leader should be able to do. I can suggest lovely ideas while speaking, but if I don't do anything when there is such a thing as a fire, then I'm not a leader. He also believes what makes MS Dhoni probably the best Fauji that isn't to be is how he understands the core of the army and the pulse of the soldiers. The core of the army is the soldiers, how they live, how they train, and how they fight. He understands it the best. There's perhaps a link there somewhere between Dhoni, the hypothetical military leader, and Dhoni, the former cricket captain of India. He was neither the most successful player in the team at the point when he took over, nor the most distinguished, another traditional expectation from an Indian captain, and didn't hail from one of the major cricket centres of the country either. He was, if anything, the first small-town superstar to take over the most coveted job in Indian team sport. His decisions were not always popular and often perplexing, but everyone watching knew they were taken with the kind of conviction that you see on the front line. Most importantly, there are very few who played under him who don't vouch for his leadership skills as he led them through many a successful operation. He was, in many ways, India's first and only Fauji captain. But Dhoni didn't have any soldier friends while growing up. Even Chittu is bemused at just when or how his longest-standing friend developed this love and obeisance for the armed forces. He doesn't even remember him talking much about the military or the army, which is not surprising considering he doesn't usually say much. In his meetings with Dhoni, though, Colonel Shankar came to know that Dhoni had an innate desire to join the army, a childhood obsession even. Those circumstances didn't quite allow him to pursue his dream. The drive remained as strong as ever. As his cricket career advanced, Dhoni was lucky enough to experience a few brushes with the military and even a few of their establishments like the National Defence Academy, NDA, and the Indian Military Academy, IMA, places he could only dream of visiting as a young man. The NDA visit was with the Indian team in the mid-2000s and he'd visited the IMA with a friend. Then came his first encounter with the parachute regiment in 2006, when the then Indian coach Greg Chappell decided to take the Rahul Dravid-led team to its training centre in Bangalore. It wasn't simply a feel-good exercise though, as the Indian players were put through the grind and had to undertake activities ranging from shooting, rock climbing, grenade throwing and many obstacle courses. By all accounts, Dhoni topped all the obstacle courses and proved to be even better than some of the Jawans. The video game buff also got a taste of simulation exercises like infiltrating enemy territory and rescuing hostages. Dhoni also learnt a trait during that 5-hour visit, which would in years to come make him the most popular non-army visitor at every military camp across the country. He has learnt to talk in the Jawan tongue. Being a Hindi-speaking guy, he could easily relate to the Jawans more than anyone else. Typically, he would always find a fellow Ranchi guy and he would say, "Aap mere gaon ke ho? You are from my village." Things like that. People would also come to him and say the same, says Colonel Shankar. According to the colonel, though, the tipping point in Dhoni's enduring love affair with the military came when he paid the National Security Guard NSG commandos a visit in Manesar on Republic Day 2009. It was part of an NDTV program and Dhoni could be seen in commando gear, overcoming his fear of heights by successfully completing a rock climbing drill, but not before a quip to his trainer about needing an external boost to calm his nerve. Later in the show, he delivered an emotional ode to the NSG for their efforts in the terror siege of 2008 in Mumbai. When the attack started and I watched it on TV, my first thought was, where is the NSG? I knew that once you guys step in, the victory would be ours. What you did was remarkable and I thank you for it. There, he also showcases his dry humor while narrating a Rajinikanth joke to the commandos as well as while clamping down on their queries about the then bachelor's marital plans. On the latter, he said, "उड़ते हुए पंछी के पर क्यों काटना चाहते हो? Why are you trying to clip the wings of an airborne bird?" Dhoni also got to meet a lot of other army officers in addition to the NSG commandos during his full-day visit and became great friends with a few of them. Some still remain a part of his Fauji circle. Dhoni, Colonel Shankar says, then wanted a taste of the actual stuff by getting a feel of where the Jawans lived and the sacrifices they make at the border. What we get to see in Kolaba, Navy Nagar and a few other military colonies, for example, is the peacetime army. He wanted to know the army from the bottom up and not by looking at it from a general's view, he says. One of his friends from the NDTV NSG visit to Manesar took Dhoni around Manesar and even got him to experience one of the most challenging and testing posts in the army. And Dhoni perhaps became the first Indian cricketer to take his position at a sentry post, even if it was for a brief while. He wanted to see how a sentry feels at night. In the night, everything seems to be moving. Even static objects seem to be moving. That's how the night is. He actually wanted to know how people react at that sentry post, because a sentry is guarding so many people. Even if you're a sepoy with just 2 years of service, you can't be waiting for any general's orders to fire, Colonel Shankar explains. And standing at sentry posts is also what young trainee officers are made to undergo. Just how he knew it was the right thing to do without any formal training like us boggles my mind, he says. I hear a lot of declarations of astonishment from Colonel Shankar during our chat. Dhoni came out of the NSG visit more determined than ever to form some sort of association with his real passion. He mentions that visit many, many times. He'll keep referring back to running into some of the soldiers he had met there. He's met thousands of Faujis in the years after that, but he keeps mentioning those guys in particular and has stayed in touch with them after nearly a decade. The boot camp in 2006 gave him the feeling that if I were in the army, I would have done well. But it was with the NSG that he was properly exposed to training and weapons and made Fauji friends, Colonel Shankar says. To be one of his Fauji friends comes with certain concessions and even greater privileges. It means you're often on a higher pedestal than anyone else, including Amitabh Bachchan. His phone might remain unreachable regardless of who you are, but he's the most active member of the WhatsApp group that he shares with his Fauji friends. He might fail to pick up Bachchan's phone call on his birthday, but he never fails to call Manoj Bhaiya, a former military man turned security head at the Jharkhand State Cricket Association JSCA Stadium in Ranchi, and whose special chai Dhoni considers his true poison, and wish his family every new year. Dhoni's almost strange apathy towards his phone is legendary. So is the list of people who have been on the receiving end of the Dhoni no-show on the phone. And try as he might, Colonel Shankar struggles to mask the envy in his voice when he talks about the activity on MS's Fauji WhatsApp groups, which he shares with his closest army friends. On that group, Dhoni, who's the last person to use his phone as a social media tool, shares pictures of himself and discusses the goings-on in his life, which even the colonel isn't always privy to. Dhoni doesn't like alcohol. He's rather vocal about his aversion to it. Some close to him say it's the smell that bothers him, especially that of champagne and beer, to the extent that he is known to change his room even if there's a whiff of it around. You won't find him in the dressing room if the team is celebrating a win by spraying champagne around, like after the Johannesburg Test win in 2006, when the Indian players went a little berserk. It was, after all, their first ever Test win in South Africa, and it was only the 14th Test of Dhoni's career, but he preferred to wait outside on the grassy bank right outside the dressing room at the bull ring and held his ground, even as some of his teammates exuberantly ran around him, carrying the bubbly and drenching each other with beer and orange juice. The wild celebration even prompted the then coach, Greg Chappell, to hold forth on drinking rather than pouring beer. Dhoni himself has often said it's the bitter taste of liquor that puts him off from drinking it. But he also has never had an issue with others around him indulging in it. Those in Ranchi recall how in his younger days he would make it a point to ensure that his closest friends always had a nice time while celebrating one of his cricketing achievements, and he would sit in the middle with a glass of drink which he rarely sipped out of, even as others guzzled away. But this pales in comparison when he plays the overindulgent host whenever his fauji friends visit him. According to someone very close to him, that's the only time even Dhoni has a drink. Not according to Colonel Shankar though. It's again more a case of him being a gracious host and ensuring that the guests have the best time possible and that they are at complete ease. Dhoni doesn't appreciate cigarettes either, but in his younger days he would often buy cigarettes from duty-free shops while on foreign tours for one of his closest friends. However, he wouldn't hand them over without a taunt. मेरे पैसे से तू खुद की जिंदगी जला रहा है. You are sending your life up in smoke on my dime. Such concessions also extend to that prickly affair that annoys not just cricketers but also cricket journalists, the demand for match tickets. I can't tell you how many relatives and friends I have fallen out with just because I've not been able to provide what they assume I owe them. What's the point of you being a cricket reporter if you can't get your cousin's sister a couple of IPL tickets? How I've tired of listening to this rant year after year, even as my honest pleas of wait, I just get an accreditation to cover the bloody thing. Why would anyone give me tickets? Would fall on deaf, stubborn ears. At least, Dhoni has the excuse of never answering his phone, not to mention that he's slightly less accessible than I am. On IPL match days, the Fauji group goes into overdrive with demands that far outstrip the reasonable. Players generally get 4 tickets, and as captain, MS would get an extra couple. It's easier for home matches, but it's for the away matches that you have to oblige the teammates from the host city. His phone would be flooded with messages saying, minimum I need 4 tickets, or zyada nahi, not a lot, 7 tickets needed, says Colonel Shankar, while revealing that he has seen Dhoni going out of his way and even managing 12 to 15 tickets if one of his army buddies asked for them. In one instance, one of his Fauji friends got shocked by just how far his cricket friend could go. One of them had messaged him for 7 tickets, and a few days later, MS told me, "Are, he never came to collect them." When I informed the Fauji concerned, he just couldn't believe Dhoni had actually taken the effort to make it happen. Dhoni doesn't usually give tickets to anyone else who contacts him directly. His rationale is that if the person is big enough to reach him, then he certainly must have access to a politician or a high-ranking government official to get the tickets. They must have already done jugaad. MS is just a backup, and also they can flaunt that Dhoni gave them a ticket. MS knows this all too well, Colonel Shankar explains. On most other occasions, it's the housekeeping staff or the waiters in the restaurants who end up as the beneficiaries. It's rather common for the last guy who cleans Dhoni's room to be asked whether anyone at home would want to watch that night's match, or for a waiter on the morning shift to receive a call from the restaurant with a simple message, "I've kept 2 tickets for you at the front desk." What Dhoni appreciates the most about his military friends is the way they treat him. They take liberties with him. Colonel Shankar says they treat him like a commando buddy, with mock disdain, like he's just one of the boys. They tell him that he's just some lowly cricketer and is no match for their real heroes. Dhoni loves such banter since at some deep level he likes being treated like a regular guy. It's a break from the hero worship that is doled out everywhere else. They criticize him too, mostly to get under his skin and generally about the nitty-gritties of his beloved uniform, the one he received while being commissioned as an honorary lieutenant colonel. They'll say he's wearing it wrong or that his dress is crumpled, says Colonel Shankar. But for someone who's dealt with criticism and public scrutiny for years, these tongue-in-cheek barbs really rattle Dhoni. So much so that he would come to the colonel and, like an adolescent who's been picked on at school, say, "Usne aisa bata diya, sir. Aapne bataya nahi ki aise lagana hai ise. He made fun of me, sir, but you never told me that this was how it should be worn." When MS Dhoni was conferred with the rank of Honorary Lieutenant Colonel in the Territorial Army of India on 1st November 2011, he didn't take off his uniform the whole day. The ceremony took place at around 9 a.m. in Delhi. There was a press conference at 4:30 p.m. and it was only at around 11 p.m. that the then Indian captain could bear to temporarily part with his treasured olive greens. Everything else you can buy, but you can't buy a uniform. That's something you earn. He was very happy about it. That gave him a lot of confidence, says Colonel Shankar. The ceremony was attended only by Sakshi and the major from the NSG, incognito, whom Dhoni by then had grown very close to. Colonel Shankar would meet him later that evening and find his friend beaming like he'd never seen him beam before. They had met for the first time at a dinner organized by Colonel Shankar's friend in the midst of India's test against South Africa in Kolkata in February 2010. The Colonel is an autograph collector and is obsessed with his sporting idols, especially those who captured our imaginations in that period between 1983 and 1991, ranging from Patrick Patterson to Sergei Bubka. Once, the Colonel was in Mumbai to get an autograph from Bubka on a couple of caricatures. The pole vault legend was there as the chief ambassador of the Mumbai Marathon, and Colonel Shankar had travelled all the way just to catch Bubka for a couple of minutes. For such a fanboy, it came as unbelievable news some 8 years ago to know that Dhoni would be having dinner with him. There were some 4 or 5 of us, and I couldn't believe that the Indian captain would come for dinner in the middle of a test. No cricket was spoken about. I took a few autographs. It was his knowledge about the Air Force and Army weapons which intrigued me. For someone rumoured to never read newspapers or watch TV, he had in-depth information about what items the Army was procuring and what was in the arsenal of some other countries. He was inquisitive too. What also stood out for me was how he looked at the Army. No jingoism on the lines of "our soldiers are sacrificing their lives," but very, very practical. Colonel Shankar recounts his first meeting with Dhoni. Shankar would soon take Dhoni along to various military establishments around the country, but there would be a lot of protocol to be followed. Around a year later, they began discussing how to get the new World Cup winning captain officially associated with the Army so that, among other things, he could visit even more military establishments. Colonel Shankar and a few of his colleagues approached the then Army Chief, General V.K. Singh, with a proposal. Kapil Dev, the last man to have lifted the World Cup trophy, and the legendary Malayalam actor Mohanlal had already been made honorary lieutenant colonels. But it wasn't smooth sailing, for the Air Force too wanted Dhoni on their ranks. Wing Commander M. Baladitya, who'd been Team India's manager for a number of years, was the keenest proponent. He'd already roped in Sachin Tendulkar as a group captain. In fact, just 3 days after Dhoni hit Nuvan Kulasekara for that famous six in the direction of the hockey stadium adjacent to Wankhede, Wing Commander Baladitya was at the then Air Force Chief P.V. Nayak's residence, and plans were being made for Dhoni to fly in an Su-30 MKI. Dhoni, though, was to remain loyal to his childhood fixation with the army. He had only one request: to be allowed to join the parachute regiment. His decision did take Colonel Shankar slightly by surprise. He had called Ranchi home for most of his life and could have joined the Bihar regiment. He then had this special adopted home link with Chennai and could have joined the Madras regiment, he says. But Dhoni, like always, had a valid explanation for his choice. He wanted to join the parachute regiment, number 1, because it's a volunteer force. Number 2 is that it's pan-India. So they are not people from one particular state or region. That intrigued him, explains Colonel Shankar. There were other perks as well. Being a paratrooper is considered elite. So Dhoni knew that they would have more exciting missions than the regular army. Moreover, most of his friends from the NSG were paratroopers. Colonel Shankar recalls that the army was slightly apprehensive as it didn't want Dhoni to be a figurehead like other celebrity inductees who would just come for an odd event here or there and maybe even charge money for coming. Finally, they decided to dovetail Dhoni's conferment ceremony with Olympic medal winner Abhinav Bindra's, who too became an honorary lieutenant colonel that day. For all his excitement regarding the rank, Dhoni was most excited to be in the olive green uniform. This was his childhood dream coming alive, and so obsessed is he with it that he carries a set everywhere he goes, much to Colonel Shankar's bewilderment. I'll say, no chance you'll get to wear it, especially during an IPL match. You'll come this afternoon, practice and go for the match. Next morning, you have to leave. Nahi, sir, kahin mil gaya to chance? No, sir, what if I get a chance? And I end up going there in a t-shirt and jeans. I've realized that more than anything, it's that uniform that fascinates him the most, says Shankar, who isn't at all surprised to have seen Dhoni proudly donning his uniform and marching towards the podium to receive his Padma Bhushan award in April 2018. Now, an official member of the army, Dhoni has started visiting even more army establishments, including a visit to the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited (HAL) factory, where he got introduced to even newer weapons. With his Test retirement in late 2014 freeing him up, Dhoni decided it was time to earn a badge and add more glory to his already glorious uniform, which at that point simply carried a territorial army logo, the paratrooper's sign, and his rank on the shoulder with the name tag above the right breast pocket. The uniform, as he would tell Colonel Shankar, was looking sukha, dry. The honorary lieutenant colonel now wanted a para-wing added to it, and a badge with blue wings and an umbrella, for which he would have to complete 5 parachute jumps at the end of a rigorous 14-15-day training schedule. After getting permission from the Board of Control for Cricket in India, BCCI, and clearance from the Defence Ministry, Dhoni reported at the 50th Parachute Brigade in Agra. There he would stay in the barracks, wake up at 4 a.m. like everyone else, and go through the rigors for the whole day at the para-training center. But while the rest of the Jawans would get to rest and recuperate after the physically draining day, the celebrity trainee had to contend with various social commitments, from drinking chai with the superiors to inaugurating an event. In 14 days, he visited 30 different places, including one government school. He later said that none of the kids knew who he was. At the end of the rigorous training session, it was time for the jump. His first jump came off an AN-32 military aircraft from around 1,300 feet. But as he would tell Colonel Shankar later, it was the second that was the toughest. First jump में पता नहीं चलता है. The first jump, you don't realize what's happening. I was just pushed out. Only then you realize, bloody how crazy this is. The second jump is the toughest. You know what's going to happen, and you're waiting. Shankar recalls him saying, "You are in a fixed line and just pushed out. It is generally safe since the parachute opens on its own. You don't have to do anything," he explains. Completing the 5 jumps and earning his badge also meant forming a stronger bond with the regiment he represented. Moreover, the fact that not many of his Fauji friends, Colonel Shankar included, had completed the 5 jumps gave his feat an additional shine. "Sir, aapne to nahi kiya hai. Sir, you have not done it," Colonel Shankar recalls Dhoni telling him soon after with great glee. That wasn't the only time Dhoni indulged in one-upmanship with the colonel. He does so every time the two go to a shooting range. Whenever possible, Dhoni makes sure that he visits one on 1st January, regardless of which part of the world he's in. The shooting range is his Kolai Devyam, Tamil for family deity, says Colonel Shankar, who remembers picking him up at 6 a.m. from Taj, Bengal on New Year's Day a few years ago, and also seeing him up and ready, decked up immaculately in his uniform. Colonel Shankar says that Dhoni can fire any weapon. He's seen the former India captain do it with at least 9 different weapons from 25 yards and hit the bullseye. It's something you expect only the most highly skilled soldier to pull off. The fact that he can do so even with a pistol, which jumps a lot more on recoil, impresses Colonel Shankar so much that he reiterates the point. Any firing is about holding, aiming, and the trigger operation. Nobody has taught him the basics, but they seem ingrained in him. His strength is amazing, so the grip is great. The aiming comes from the natural alignment of his body, and of course, he's worked hard to master the technique of trigger operation. Normally, we soldiers pick a new weapon and spend the first round only on zeroing. He picks up, and within 2 shots, he has gained enough information about the weapon to strike bull, he explains. The irrepressible competitor in Dhoni naturally makes sure that every visit to the shooting range results in a shootout between the two friends. He beats me hollow every time and will even tease me saying things like, "Sir, aap hamesha daएं बाएं मारते हो. Sir, you always strike right or left of the target." I always tell him that in combat I've proved myself and killed terrorists. "You've only proved yourself on the range." That's our standard banter. But you can see how thrilled he is to get the better of an active soldier, Colonel Shankar says with a beaming smile. He also quickly recalls the time Dhoni beat former Australian pace great Glenn McGraw, a lifelong hunter, at a clay pigeon shooting face-off in Kimberley during the 2009 IPL, which was played in South Africa. And he did so as clinically and cerebrally as he finishes off a run chase. Dhoni takes his ravenous curiosity to the shooting range too, and as Colonel Shankar says, he won't just pick up a new weapon and fire away. It's not just some trigger-happy indulgence for him. Instead, he'll go into the mechanics of it, ask why it's particularly better than others, or he'll read up on them and give seasoned officers information that they wouldn't have been aware of. Like, "Sir, there are certain weapons that'll give you sight where the laser pointer is, and very few Indian weapons have that. He'll also want to know whether the one he's hitting bull with will be as effective in combat as it is on the range. It's again something we are taught as young officers, to first understand a weapon in its entirety before learning to fire it, says Colonel Shankar. In an army establishment, it's a different Dhoni that shows up. When the colonel and Dhoni are together in his room or on the road, when he often picks on the cricket mad colonel, saying, "Sir, आप IPL में क्या कर रहे हो? डोकलाम में होना चाहिए आपको." "Sir, what are you doing in IPL? You should be in Doklam." But when they visit a military unit, he makes it a point to play second fiddle to the colonel. He acknowledges the hierarchy and respects it. He salutes really well now, says the colonel. Now he doesn't get confused with ranks. It's easy for a civilian to get confused with military jargon. Prior to such visits, he'll ask me, "इसको कैसे बुलाना है? कौन से रेजिमेंट का है? बहुत लोग आ गए तो कैसे बुलाना है? How should I address him? Which regiment is he from? When a lot of people come, how do I address them? Who should be the priority?" says Colonel Shankar. And Dhoni doesn't mind erring on the side of overdoing the respect, even if it means addressing every Fauji he meets at a camp as Sir. It's at these army bases that Dhoni's innate knowledge about military life really shines through, leaving Colonel Shankar flabbergasted every time. While celebrity visits are largely publicized, Dhoni insists on informing the people in charge only at the last minute. That's not to keep them guessing, but to ensure that his audience isn't restricted to the best people they have or simply officers with their wives. Dhoni always prefers meeting the Jawans since he feels he can make a bigger difference to their lives, and also because he connects with them more in terms of background, work ethic, and an earthy approach to life. Colonel Shankar would call beforehand and ask for 30-40 Jawans to be quickly assembled, and the initial volley of questions to Dhoni would all involve cricket, along with a few about his personal life, especially after the movie came out. But Dhoni, of course, as any journalist who has attended even a single press conference of his would know, has this ability to effortlessly steer a question you want answered towards one that he wants to answer. As Colonel Shankar says, he does it subtly, without sounding rude, and manages to tug at the Jawan's heartstrings. As Colonel Shankar reveals, he would start telling them about how his father wasn't a big shot and that, much like them, he's away from his home and family for long periods. He once told a bunch of them that at his peak, he got 40 days off in a year, out of which he had brand endorsements to deal with, leaving him with not more than 8 to 9 days in a year at home. He tells them, "I'm exactly like you. But at least you guys have the freedom to go meet your friends and relatives on your off days. I am mainly cocooned in my hotel, and it's almost like a jail to me." He also slips in lines such as, like them, he too has to take care of his finances despite all his wealth, which immediately strikes a chord with the Jawans, Colonel Shankar says. Soon, it's Dhoni who's asking questions, mainly centered around the agricultural land that invariably an average Jawan owns or tends to back home. They'll range from who's taking care of them to how the crop is this time. That again makes the soldiers' eyes light up, says the colonel. They'll start telling him stories excitedly. "साहिब, इस बार बारिश ही नहीं हुई. पापा ने ऐसा किया, बीज में हमने ये डाला. Sahib, this time there was no rains. Papa tried to do this. In between, we tried to sow this." In the army, young officers are made to live with the Jawans. It's part of their grooming process, paving the making of a good military leader. The stay can last anywhere between 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on the regiment. Colonel Shankar reveals that in some Gorkha units, the officer cannot enter the officer's mess for food till he's learned to speak Nepali fluently. The guys in the unit there speak only Nepali, so they make sure you know the language properly. If you are from a Muslim unit, you have to go for prayers to know what namaz is about. It's done so that we can lead them effortlessly, he says. Having a drink with a Jawan or going to the Bada Khana, a feast organized on special occasions, even if the food is saltier than what your dietary demands dictate, rather than sticking to the mess, is a great way of bonding. It's a tradition that is passed down generation after generation of senior officers to their successors. Dhoni, of course, has had no formal training in becoming an officer or a military leader. But heck, he's barely had formal training to be a cricketer. He just found his own way of becoming one. But like Colonel Shankar keeps reiterating, Dhoni just seems to have an inherent understanding of the significance of bonding with the soldiers. Or, like he says, with the same astonishment as always, where did he get that from? For while Dhoni is known to rarely have anything more than a piece of chicken or a glass of water when presented with a gourmet feast at the officer's mess, he doesn't miss out on a single item offered to him from the soldier's kitchen. He'll relish the Jawan's chai handed to him in a steel glass. He'll barely touch the continental and English fare laid out by the officers, but with the Jawans, he'll have one small piece of the pakoda and taste all the sweets. He realizes that it makes a difference to their lives. They'll say, Dhoni Sahab ne ye khaya, Dhoni Sahib ate this. They'll talk about it forever, says Colonel Shankar. The colonel further explains that there's no greater satisfaction for an officer when a soldier who served under him comes to him after many years and says, "Yaad hai main aapke saath wahan tha, aap bahut अच्छे थे. Remember, I was there with you. You were very good." That's exactly the feedback Colonel Shankar gets from those who have interacted with Dhoni. They'll say, "Dhoni Sahab kya अच्छा बोले थे. मैंने भी घर में जाके बताया. How well Dhoni sir spoke. I told my family too." The same Jawan will then say that while MS wanted only group photos, they managed to sneak in a selfie with him. It's often how happy the soldiers are under an officer's command that determines his annual appraisal. The Jawans might not be the one writing the final report, but the man who is does so only after taking their opinion. It can be little things like whether you sacrificed watching a movie to attend one of their unit events. We also have the usual yardsticks ranging up to outstanding. But if your boss writes that you are a good asset both in war and peace, then you have achieved the highest honor, says Colonel Shankar. Like Dhoni did when former India coach Gary Kirsten said, "I want to go to war with this guy," a few months after the two had seen India lift the World Cup on that famous night at the Wankhede Stadium. Most of Dhoni's conversations at these army camps, and he's now visited a lot of them, from the southern part of the country to Kashmir and Leh in the very north, are bond-building exercises with the Jawans. He also tells them how they idolize him while he looks up to them. As captain, Dhoni has earned many sobriquets, from that of being an impulsive gambler and astute tactician to a rather reactionary skeptic in Test cricket. But he has never ever shied away from taking a decision on his own terms, whether it made sense or not to the outside world or even his teammates. And decision-making is an issue that he gets quizzed on a lot by the soldiers he meets by the dozens. He, however, uses it as a platform to declare his views on how war and cricket should never be spoken of in the same breath. Forget putting on the same pedestal. He tells them, the more and more decisions you take, the more and more times you'll make, says Colonel Shankar. More decisions you take, the number of mistakes will come down. He says in a war, it is life and death. You might not get another chance. When people say India-Pakistan match ek jang hai is war, he says that's completely wrong. People lose lives and there's destruction, not only of the army but the whole country, says Colonel. Dhoni is also aware of the ills of the army, whether it is to do with the bureaucracy or the lack of equipment, and he questions them wherever he goes. He's found that if the right people are asked the tough questions, they sit up and realize that they cannot fake it with him. A young Dhoni is said to have been similar in the Indian dressing room, at that point boasting of some of the biggest names in the history of the sport. He never spoke out of line, but he never shied away from making his point of view heard either. If he had a point, he would make it. It was a trait that he displayed a lot as Indian captain. He remained steadfast in calling a spade, or in pointing out the white elephant in the room, even if there were times in his career when critics said that he could have done more of it. When he led India for the first time during the triangular series in Australia back in 2007-2008, Dhoni was clear about not wanting a particular senior batsman in the lineup. He had an issue with his running between the wickets, the number of dot balls he consumed, and said he won't even bring up his fielding ability when asked for his reasons by the selector representing this particular player's zone. He had very objective and pointed explanations for each of his specific concerns about this player. About his running between the wickets, Dhoni is learned to have said that he couldn't be sure whether that batsman would complete the run or stop in between, and such indecisiveness would have a negative effect on his partner's mindset. When pointed out that the batsman didn't have a bad strike rate by the prevailing standards, then Dhoni, never a big believer in numbers, is learned to have said, 4 dot balls, last 2 balls पे एक boundary, एक single or double, strike rate हो गया 90. 4 dot balls, a boundary and 1 or 2 runs on the last 2 balls, that takes the strike rate to 90. The number of dot balls is the problem with this stat, and true to his word, he didn't speak a word about his fielding. Eventually, the batsman in question wasn't picked for the squad and never played ODIs for India again. But when India found themselves in a tight spot during one of the matches in the tournament, Dhoni used the axing he'd engineered to motivate or send a quiet warning to his players. I want to say only this. I've dropped a lot of big players to bring you guys in. Abhi kuch karna padega aap logon ko. You guys have to do something now. As always, a man of few words. India, of course, went on to win that game and the Tri-Series, the first time they'd won a tournament down under since 1985, when they had won the World Series. How can you give away a rank as prestigious as that to a cricketer, while we've earned and achieved it through our sweat and blood? What has he done for the army? That's a question that is asked a lot about most honorary military officers by those who actually serve the country on the front line. It's a valid one too. No civilian or even a Bollywood star has yet received an honorary test cap from the BCCI after all, just for argument's sake, even if the comparison might not be a direct fit. Colonel Shankar admits that the sense of antipathy towards their high-profile celebrity inductee doesn't arise from envy. It has instead got more to do with Dhoni not being one to overtly promote the armed forces. He does it more subtly and at times anonymously. especially in financial matters, without beating a single drum, unlike others of his ilk. If they are not able to meet him, or they have introduced themselves as army officers and haven't been given an audience with him, they feel like he's not living up to the expectations. They don't know the kind of work he does. They think that he should spend crores on the army widows. सियाचिन में एक बंदा मर गया, उसके लिए कुछ नहीं किया, एक ट्वीट भी नहीं. A soldier dies in Siachen, he doesn't do anything, not even one tweet, they ask. For him, it matters more to speak to a Jawan and find out more. He feels it's about leadership and not showmanship, says Colonel Shankar. It does make sense why his detractors would think that Dhoni isn't doing enough, considering the present political climate of the country, where social media has become the platform and the pulpit to emblazon and preach about your patriotism, even if it borders on jingoism. The fact that Dhoni doesn't toe this line leads to the misconception that he doesn't care and is only there to reap the benefits of holding a senior rank. So much so that some officers get annoyed when they hear that Dhoni is visiting their unit. The perception completely changes for anyone who's met him even for 10 minutes. They're like, "Hamare type ka banda hai yaar. He's like us." And within minutes after him leaving, their WhatsApp profile pictures have changed from the tricolour to MS Dhoni. That's his impact, says Colonel Shankar, laughing before listing out the various Dhoni contributions to the army, including lakhs of rupees spent on widows and martyr families. Dhoni chooses subtler ways of promoting the army. It's become such a routine to see some part of Dhoni's apparel depicting or representing the army. He'll have those army fatigues on while travelling or even otherwise. His wicket-keeping gloves are custom designed under his own supervision and carry a military theme and a name that resonates with it, MSD Warrior. His kit bag has had the fatigues theme for a few years now and is now popular among other cricketers too, both among those who play for India at the highest level and in the suburbs of Mumbai and Delhi who play for their local clubs. More often than not, it's a direct statement in support of the army rather than having anything to do with fashion. Colonel Shankar says it's Dhoni's way of giving back to the army, at least in terms of exposure. He does it because he feels that people will notice. If not the fatigues, he'll have t-shirts with telltale signs. Then they'll ask, why and what is written? Why does it say airborne? What is airborne? He says, when I wear it, people take a lot of pictures and post them. So, at least that way the goodwill will spread. Dhoni has his own theory, not surprisingly, about why the army needs to be promoted more or the air around it cleared as much as possible. He wants people to see how the soldiers live off the land in the border areas and the kind of sacrifices they make rather than simply relying on newspaper headlines, which brings us to his pet peeve. Why is it that when an army guy does something wrong, his profession is always mentioned in the headline, like, say, ex-army did this and that? But when a lawyer or journalist does it, they just put a name and never bring his profession into disrepute. Dhoni would ask the colonel repeatedly. The army, Dhoni is said to believe, is always put on a pedestal because they're expected to have an unreasonable level of moral uprightness, and as a result, any negative news about them alters the rest of the country's opinion of them greatly. And it's this reason that pushes him to try and promote the positives of the army to a greater extent. The helicopter shot is synonymous with MS Dhoni, despite the fact that it wasn't originally his creation or the fact that he seems out of touch with it these days. But he's never quite lost touch with his expertise on helicopters. At one glance, he can identify its make. He uses this shrewdly to create a shock effect, especially when he's around someone from the military. Colonel Shankar recalls the time he was taken to South Africa for a tour and how Dhoni just saw a copter take off from the airfield next to the one where they were waiting to board a flight and immediately identified exactly which one it was. Just like that, and not for the first or the last, he'd left the colonel shaking his head in disbelief. It's a unique skill that he's developed mainly through his natural powers of observation and also due to his insatiable inquisitiveness. He puts it to full use and ends up being a de facto intelligence gatherer whenever he's on an away tour. The security officials assigned to the Indian team generally happen to be former military guys. Dhoni's modus operandi is to start a conversation about their weapon and make an observation or two about it. The guy will look at him with raised eyebrows and say, "How come you know about it?" He'll then tell him about his love for weapons. Then they'll bond over how both of them are a part of their country's special forces, and the conversation will drift towards comparing the kind of weapons each country possesses in its arsenal, says Colonel Shankar. Whatever information is gathered is then duly passed on to the colonel, but always with a rider. "Sir, if South Africa can have this and this weapon, why don't we have it?" That leaves the colonel speechless, with only a sheepish grin to show. Dhoni the cricketer has never been known to obsess or even get hooked to the finer details of batting or wicket-keeping techniques. He's got a very Frank Sinatra, I-do-it-my-way approach to both. In later years, he has done work with video analysts to fine-tune certain aspects of his batting. But it's been more need-based and more to do with alignment without getting too pedantic over the nitty-gritties. I remember him telling a video analyst who was working with his technique during the 10th edition of the IPL, "Sir, I've just woken up and had some chai. Give me a few balls and the bat will come down the way you want it to." However, he's known to get very technical while handling a weapon, and according to Colonel Shankar, will keep shifting the gun around in his hand to find out the best way to hold it so that it fires at its optimum. For, as Colonel Shankar puts it, he's always looking to tinker around even with day-to-day objects and see if they can be put to any unconventional use. It could range from using a mobile phone as a projectile to using a phone charger to make toast. The more extreme, the better. Even with weapons, he spends a good deal of time talking about how they could be modified. No wonder then that he keeps putting up Instagram videos of opening up his bikes and putting them back together like they are Lego pieces. It's got a lot to do with his very foggy principle of never calling room service for any aid and using the resources available to fix any problem. It could be a pen that's stuck or even a sole that's come loose. Dhoni will not let anyone call for help and take 10 minutes to figure something out, whether it's using a shoelace or a safety pin or anything. It's again something that's achieved by practicing daily. This is an ingenuity that comes through in every facet of his cricket too, which the world has gotten used to by now. And you believe it's some form of raw urge that he needs to constantly get his hands to produce something out of nothing. This is often seen in his batting, where Dhoni, who, apart from being a hands-on captain, also tends to be very hands-on in his batting, as his hands often do more work than his feet, especially the way he drives the ball through the covers where the wrists take over completely at the point of contact and would find gaps through packed off-side fields. Meetings between Dhoni and the colonel are, of course, mainly centered around him going, "Sir, और बताओ ना, उस mission में क्या हुआ? Sir, tell me more, no? What happened on that mission?" और चाइना ने ऐसा कर दिया सर, साउथ चाइना सी में, भूटान में क्या हो रहा है सर? China did that in the South China Sea. What's happening in Bhutan? Over time, Colonel Shankar has realized that Dhoni has a penchant for the unconventional. This is reflected in the Fauji's he calls friends, guys who are different, as the colonel puts it, or when it comes to civilians, even journalists. It's the same when it comes to army missions. War is too organized for his liking. Even army operations where things are clear with planned attacks don't really get him going. Conventional things don't attract him. What he really gets fascinated by are cross-border attacks where information is scarce and soldiers often have to go against the norm to succeed, says Colonel Shankar. But of course, to steal a Dhoni catchphrase, there are questions that need to be answered too. Suppose the information that has come our way is wrong. What do we do? What are the contingency plans? These are tactical and strategic questions that all young officers ask when they are coming up the ranks. So does MS, the colonel adds. Nothing, though, quite excites him as much as finding himself in a scenario where he needs to make contingency plans. There was the Delhi hotel fire, of course, but Colonel Shankar recalls another instance a few years ago. Dhoni had been invited for an event where many people were expected to gather. He was concerned about a potential melee upon his arrival. So he came up with a strategy. With just 2 kilometers to go for the venue, Dhoni told Colonel Shankar and his driver that they'd all have to switch places in the car. एक काम करते हैं. Let's do one thing. I will drive from here. You sit next to me and we'll ask the driver to sit in the back, were Dhoni's orders to the colonel. Dhoni's view was that as soon as those awaiting his arrival see a car, they would naturally look for Dhoni in the back seat, not find him and think he's not here yet. He said, you wear a cap, people will look at you and say, no, he's too dark. Nobody will look at the driver's seat, recalls Colonel Shankar. The plan worked to perfection, not surprisingly.